I'm telling y'all right now, all of these wonderful people would not be here without Patreon supporters like you. If you enjoy credible news, reviews, and commentary on UFOs and UAPs 5 days a week, you want to support this show. What's your name? Marty. Marty, look how easy this is, Marty. Pick up your phone. Boom! You're a Patreon member. I mean, look, it's so easy. You just click the link, which is right here. Just for $1 a month, you can support this show. Just fill out the information and pledge what's comfortable for you. It could be $1, $5, $10, or who knows. Just support.
Hello, and welcome to another week at the Unidentified Celebrity Review. It's going to be an interesting one today. We'll revisit an old case with someone who has dug beneath the surface. It may make you rethink what you know. And rethinking what you know is a valuable skill. Avi Loeb calls his recent UFO undertaking the Galileo Project, referencing the time when Galileo's contemporaries refused to look through the telescope, fearing that the knowledge would upset their entrenched sensibilities. And the comparison is often used as a jab at the modern scientific community, implying that they are too afraid to consider the wild possibilities that some posit. And it's a valid criticism. But it cuts the other way as well. Believers should not be afraid to look at evidence through skeptical eyes. Instead of blocking people you don't agree with on Twitter, you should try to fully understand why those you disagree with say what they say. Different perspectives should not be viewed as threatening, but rather a chance for illumination. You may discover the conflicting viewpoint is actually correct. Or you may discover valid arguments against that viewpoint and further the conversation. Without looking at it, or worse, actively avoiding evidence, you won't find anything new. So don't be afraid to look through new telescopes. And don't be afraid of those who try to get you to look. We're all here searching for the same thing, the truth. And let's get that search started. Please join me in welcoming our hosts of UCR, UFO Jane and Luis Jimenez.
Hey guys.
Hey guys.
How was the weekend?
Went by too fast.
It was the end of a long month. So
yeah, I know, Jane. You've been through hell and back with this
virus.
Well,
I'm not the only one.
Yeah.
So I know there's many out there who can empathize. So
for sure.
Yeah.
Well, welcome everyone. Hello. Good morning. Good evening. Good day. Good afternoon, and aloha. Welcome back to another episode of the Unidentified Celebrity Review. Your home for credible news, reviews, and commentary on everything UAP and UFO. My name's Luis Jimenez. We've already know who Rather and Jane are. Welcome, guys. I'm so happy you're here. Glad the weekend was good. I'm glad we're doing better. Hope February, if your weekend wasn't good, if your month wasn't good, we're going into February tomorrow. So hopefully this next month will be a lot better for you. With that said, I want to say thank you to DOS Tapes. They provide all of the tunes you hear on the show. Their Bandcamp link is in the description below. Want to say thank you, of course, to everyone in the chats. Fifi Barboa, UAP, ATU Rower, AT Roar. I think I got it. Joey, Lord Bass, Kathy Splash, Awaiting Aliens, Event Tide, Joe Greenwood, all of you guys in here. Thank you so damn much for being here. Truly appreciate it. There's already a super chat from Joe M, who says, I'm in love with Rather. I 100% support that super chat. And I ditto.
You are
100%.
not alone.
Yeah. I think 3 for 3. Everyone's in love with you, Rather.
I said the comeback kid, remember?
Indeed. Indeed.
Appreciate you all.
Thank you for the super chat. That's a great way to support the show. We are a public access channel. We're supported by viewers like you. So we truly appreciate it. Also, check out the Patreon for as little as $1 a month. You can help support the show. There's no paywalls here. We don't hide any of our shows behind a paywall, so you can enjoy
Not even the dollar store.
Not even the dollar store. Yeah. You're right.
I think they're actually having to change the name, or maybe that was like a Onion story.
Yeah, well, I
don't know, but
I think I saw like one time like $1.49 store.
Yeah, I believe that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Somebody got sick
I
of
mean,
it.
dude, and getting anything for $1 these days, it's
I mean,
gonna be tough.
$1.49. I'll take it. I think
Yeah.
I'll
Well,
still go to
if
that
I could get a
store.
piece of steak for $1.49, I'm
gonna go
buying
to the
it.
dollar store. and figure it
That
out
might not be a wise
$1.49
decision,
store.
Lou.
Yeah, no, probably not. Probably not. All right, you guys. Also, before we get started with the show, don't forget to check out the links below. We got links for not only Jane and Rather here into their shows and their channels. We've also got the link for our guest today. Also, we've got the link for our merch store. And thank you, KJRADB, for replaying all of our shows. And we are live there every Friday from 1 to 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So let's get into it, you guys. Let's introduce our guest. I saw Jane. Am I correct to say that you had like a pad and a pen ready to go for this interview?
I had some notes I was like taking, and then they were all jumbled, and so I was trying to clean them up very quickly, so I might be able to formulate some questions, but we'll see.
All right, fair enough. All right, well, let us bring on our guest, and that is author and investigator Christian Lambright. He has a book called X Descending, which explores the mystery of reality and human potential and covers a broad range of subjects from quantum physics and the fabric of reality to the boundaries of human consciousness and experience, with an interest in whatever intrigues and educates and leads us to examine the depths of human experience. Certainly requires an open mind, but also a willingness to face hard truths. The book S Descending is based on a film, evidence of 2 encounters that he has personally knowledge of and experience with, and he stands by the facts presented. Without further ado, Mr. Christian Lambright. Hello, sir. How are you?
How are you? Hello, everyone. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pleasure to have you here. So I had the pleasure of meeting you on Martin Willis's show for his 10th anniversary show, I believe it was.
Yeah,
it was wild. So I was literally there. I was supposed to be the guest for the day, and Martin sprung on me, hey, by the way, we're having 100 people come on because it's the anniversary. I had no idea. You just happened to be the day that the show was on. So I got to stay there for the whole thing, and the whole time I'm writing down names of the people I want to talk to, and Christian Lambright was one of them. So
I will say I was impressed with you because, and you probably picked it up in the whole thing, that it's that enthusiasm that you have that I feel like some of us older guys have just been around the mill a few too many times, that I wish we still had your enthusiasm.
No, hey, listen, that's not the first time I've heard it. I remember having a conversation with Ted Rowe over at NARCAP, and this was I could just feel the frustration oozing through the telephone when I was talking to him. And then 4 months later, they're inviting NARCAP to an aviation conference where they're talking about safety and new things that are happening within the FAA. I can't remember the name of the conference, excuse me. But they invited Ted Rowe to make a presentation and talk about this subject for a couple of hours over a few days period. So that reinvigorated him from the last time I spoke to him, because he's like, Lou, for the first time, they're taking it seriously. They're having a serious conversation about this phenomenon at a very official, usually boring kind of conference that never ever would even entertain this kind of topic. He's starting to share the enthusiasm, and I think he sees where at least I'm getting a little bit of mine. But I also understand, especially if you've been in this game for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, the frustration that I'm sure comes with not only investigating this, talking to the people on the ground, having your boots on the ground, but investing your time, investing your energy. And, like you were saying before the show started, it's like screaming at the top of your lungs to the world of knowledge that you think people should take seriously. You
mentioned the historical context going back 50 years, and and I'm like, boy, that really dates me, but I am there. But one of the things that, and I don't think it's just me, it's guys who've been at this longer than I have. The whole idea that, those who forget the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole idea that history repeats itself. When you look at even the way things are today, where it feels like in the last 4 years, 3-4 years, we've had a lot more awareness and people willing to talk. And a lot of that, I'm sure I credit to the credibility of Dave Fravor and the Nimitz pilots, and you see their faces when they're talking. But way back during the Blue Book days, people thought, oh, here it is. The Air Force is actively looking into this. And then back in the 70s, you had congressional hearings where even the Coyne helicopter encounter, Commander Coyne goes and talks before Congress. And you begin to realize that somehow along the way, the thing rides like a roller coaster ride when you think it should come out to where people stick to it, stay with the awareness of it. But it seems that it eventually just kind of fades away. And then all of a sudden you realize, history repeated itself, that now you're back to square one. Or the only thing that's left over are the publicity seekers, the people that are willing to say and do whatever it takes to get invited to the next conference. And
right.
And it is frustrating. It is.
Christian, please don't kill me because I asked you to lower your mic volume when you first came in. People say that it's a little too low. So that's on me, guys. It sounded like Mike when first popped, but that could just been a signal. So let's see if he can adjust that now for you guys and see how it sounds. Go ahead.
Or is that worse? I turned it down some. Can you hear me?
I think it's about the same.
I think you can
turn it up. Yeah, you can turn it up.
Yep.
Yeah. I know. I told you to turn it down when you came in. I'm sorry.
Rule number 1 of UCR: don't listen to Lou.
Yeah, it's a pretty good rule.
How about that? Is that better?
You can pump it up a little more.
Okay, I can talk louder.
All right, I think that might be good. What do you guys think? If it's not, let's see what the audience says.
Yeah, okay.
Sometimes we run into these third world, these first world problems. So it's we'll get through it. It's not a problem.
Okay. Well, tell me to turn it down if you need me to, or I can speak up.
No, I think you sound good. Let's see what people are saying here. All right, I don't hear anything, guys. What do you guys think out there? Let us know. Is his mic too low, or does it sound good? So far so good. Okay. So Christian, one quote from the book that I thought was really, really interesting was this one. A doctor at a psychiatric ward was trying to help a patient who was suffering from a delusion that he was actually dead. After thinking of a creative way to convince the patient he was in fact alive, the doctor finally asked him, "Tell me, do dead people bleed?" The patient immediately replied, "Of course not." At that, the doctor took out the pin and pricked the patient's finger, and sure enough, he began to bleed. The patient was astonished and stared at his finger for a long time before he slowly looked up at the doctor and said, "I guess they do bleed." And I took this two ways. I felt like this is such a great analogy for both sides of this conversation, the extreme skeptic and the extreme believer. It almost feels like no matter what evidence you put in front of those personalities, they're going to come up with a reason why the ghost bleeds. Can you touch on that a little bit? Because I thought that was such a wonderful quote.
That little saying, that story was told to me by one of my psychology professors when I was in school. I have a background in psychology, and the reason that I put that at the beginning of the book is exactly I think hopefully the way you took it, which is, and it seems to me to be what we're confronted with more so today. And it goes to the issue of not simply trust, but of people's motives and motivations and what we want to believe, and especially how hard it is to turn around when you've gone so long in one direction and you've believed all that way that you could. And there was actually an interesting article I was reading today about something similar to this, where preconceptions, what people think is right. And unfortunately, to some extent, and we probably all seen this, you come across the old two bullies on the playground, where when they go home later, they'll be thinking to themselves what maybe the facts really should have been. But on the playground, neither one wants to back down. and they're going to stand by whatever they're butting their chest together. And so calling somebody out publicly, yeah, maybe later they'll go home and think about it, but you've made an enemy to some extent. You know, there's a really great little quote that I've read in a number of places, which is, be kind first, be right later. But the whole idea is to understand that, like in the case of the guy who pricked his finger, obviously there was far more going on that's gotten him into that position, that he needs to believe he's dead for some reason. Right. You know, my father coincidentally was a psychiatrist, and there were times I asked him, I said, sometimes when people come to talk to you, don't you pretty quickly get an idea of what the problem is? And he said, yeah, at times, but usually they put such a fine lid on it, and that's all that's holding them together, that you can't just tear that lid off, because they'll reject it and call you and walk out, and you wouldn't have helped them at all. And that's when you begin to realize that sometimes there's something else going on. And, you know, the whole term, you know, you have to look at yourself in the mirror. Right. Well, usually you look at yourself in the mirror at a private moment when you're someplace by yourself and you're not really being confronted by somebody challenging some belief that you have. And unfortunately, many of us, I'm afraid, and I question myself more so these days after the last 6 months than before, about how many things have I believed, because that's the way I was raised. And if I give them up, am I in some way dismissing the people who instill those beliefs or value? Although I will honestly say, these days I've about decided I don't believe anything anymore. I have things that I think, and I have a few things, when you think about it, because I tell myself at times, you know, if all you know is what somebody else told you, you don't really know anything. You just have hearsay. You know what? So there are a few things that I know. But beyond that, I have things that I think. I have conclusions that I've tried my best to carefully reach. But the things that I was told directly by people that I talked to directly, and in all honesty, there are still things that you hear from people that are way out there. You know, when I first talked to Paul Benowitz the first time on the phone, I was about to, yeah, okay. You know, it was just by that time, and I didn't talk to him at the very beginning. It was a few years later that I finally, for whatever reason, and I have that knack, I don't know if it's a good thing or not, that at some point I'll just pick up the phone and call and ask the person myself. And it was at the very end when I said, well, what did you call the Air Force for to begin with? And then it's like, oh, it was the films that I got from my roof. And I'm like, wait, what? So beyond all the craziness that was already being spread around about him at the time, you go back to the crux, like an arson investigator who finds that one point where the fire actually began. And that changed everything. If I had just listened to what other people said, that, oh, he's some guy thinks aliens here and there, I would have never called him to begin with. But you know what? This is the point with saying I choose to not believe anything, because I don't want to argue anymore. Everybody's entitled to believe what they want. I'll tell you something that I've never not said something that I've heard, but I'm not going to force somebody to listen or continue. But as an example, Roswell. I have some things I think about Roswell. I've read the books and I've read the whole story, and I've been to Roswell and driven through there. But years ago, when the TV shows run, you watch the movies, and I'd see the interviews with Jesse Marcel. And I'd realize they'd show this whole setup, right? The recreations of whatnot. Then they'd cut to him interviewing, segments of the interview with him talking directly about the things he found. Then they'd cut back to show what the story was. And I realized, but they never asked him directly, did you see something out there that made you think this was part of a crash disk, or however you want to call it? So I was with a really good friend of mine I still talk to every day. I think it was at his house. I said, you know what? We found Marcel's phone number, and I called him on the phone. He was living in Houma, I guess that's how you pronounce it, Houma, Louisiana at the time. And he had that accent from Louisiana. And we got to tell, very nice guy. He's free and easy to talk to. But at one point, I finally asked him, I said, well, let me ask this question, then. When you went out there, and it was him and 2 or 3 other people drove a couple of trucks out there, and I said, was there anything that you saw out there that made you think this, and I used 2 or 3 different terms, I said, that made you think this was part of a crashed flying saucer, UFO, disc, whatever? And he said, no. Now he said, but let me tell you, there was a truckload and a half of this material. And I'm like, 2 things I thought of. Well, first off, he was very easygoing, flat out stated. There was nothing, I mean, in other words, it wasn't like there was a big crash disc there. Now, I know there's other stories to Roswell on the other side of the plains of St. Augustine, and some of that is interesting to me. But as far as what Jesse Marcel himself found, he was made it clear that, yeah, there was a whole lot of whatever the material was, but it was clearly material that he and the other people there were able to pick up and load in the truck, you know, a truckload and a half of whatever this material was. But I realized, to me at least, that's just my opinion, at that point, Jesse Marcel, as far as himself in that specific scenario about him having been a witness to a crashed disc, you know, everything, just the balloon deflated it, as far as my mind, in chasing that angle. Maybe, yeah, maybe on the other side of the plain to St. Augustine, where Barney Barnett, whoever approached that, okay, that's, I haven't looked into. But at the same time, it becomes a matter of what are you going to spend your time and energy looking into, and unless there's some meat there or something you can sink your teeth into.
Did you ask him any further questions about the debris, like some of the other claims about it?
I understand.
Being
I wish
memory, or yeah, because I know I did ask grandson or grandson if there were purported symbols on the debris, because there's reports that there were kind of almost like hieroglyph like symbols on it, and they're kind of similar to Rendlesham, and he confirmed that yes, indeed it was, you know,
what Jesse Marcel has described in the interviews, finding the little beams with like markings, hieroglyphic stuff, I have no doubt about it.
So
I believe him 100% of everything he said.
Different
it's
puzzle
just
pieces.
The way it's edited begins to make you think he's now being presented in some way supporting this whole crash disc scenario. For example, the other day, I don't remember the name of it right now, which is probably a good thing, but there was a video I watched somewhere else that it was online, and they were basically doing a cut into the recent the case of the 2 young boys out in south of Socorro, that was written about in Paula Harris and Jacques Vallée's book. Now, I'm not familiar with that case, but in the video, I mean, except what I read, but in the video, they were talking about this case of the 2 boys, and they cut into an image, very nicely done illustration of the Socorro case with the police officer and the 2, which is a case I'm very familiar with, I mean, we'll go to that later, but I realized, but wait a minute, that case should not, I mean, why didn't they do an illustration of what the actual case was? Now, I don't know whether that's, the sketch was, you know, what can you say? It's Hollywood, right?
I have a feeling they probably just had that sketch sitting around somewhere, and they're like, oh yeah, use that one, instead of actually paying somebody to do a new sketch.
People who are less aware of it, now their image in their mind of that case is represented by, just like Jesse Marcel becomes kind of a token poster boy for something that's not quite what he said.
Okay, so I know Jane definitely wants to dive into the Roswell part of this a little bit, and you mentioned Paul Benowitz, so I want to dive that in a little bit.
I mean, yeah,
and then also Socorro. So those are 3 things that we could really sort of pick your brain on. Please don't kill me.
I'm going to give you my opinion.
Yeah.
This is my opinion.
No.
Nobody has to believe what I say. I mean,
we don't want facts here. We don't want facts when it comes to UFO.
You may know a lot more about Roswell than I do. I've just been around a long time, so I picked up a lot of that stuff as well.
We can talk more on the Paul Benowitz, you know,
whatever you want to talk about that I can offer something with, I'm glad to.
It's all
I don't want to claim to be an expert on things that
Right.
I'll leave to other people about, and that I'm not. I mean, the Rendlesham case is an interesting one because, not to say so, but you know, I was around back in 1980 when this whole thing broke. But one of the things I've talked about with friends of mine is a lot of the things that have now become hugely popular mainstays of that case weren't even being brought up back in 1980. I mean, I have not spoken to Pennison or any of the other guys, so I don't really need to say anything about it, but I don't remember any of that information coming up back then, even the Charles Halt information.
We should try to get Jim Penniston on. I think he's done interviews before. That would be interesting.
Yeah, better person to talk to than me.
Yeah, I haven't talked to him either. Yeah.
Okay, so real quick, before we get into those things, what I was going to say, Mark Davis says, we don't want facts, Luke. Yes, we want facts. I'm just saying we don't want people claiming to know that they have all of the facts.
Fact-free interview today.
Yeah, fact-free interview today. This is all opinion-based, but real quick, Christian, if you could just for the last time, and I promise it's going to be the last time I bother you about it, if we can't fix it on this time, we'll just work through it. But is your mic or your headset set to the one you actually have on there? Because everybody's saying it's the mic from the computer that's picking
it is, but what if I turn the mic up like this?
No. What I'm saying is your audio is being picked up by your actual laptop or your desktop instead of your headphone piece.
Yeah, so if you go to Cam Mic and go to...
I got you. I'm following you now. Hold on one second.
I've done that before.
Hang on for me 1 second.
It's all right. We live for the awkward here.
You're absolutely correct.
Perfect.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
Oh, my gosh, that's amazing.
Yeah, awesome. Well,
Man,
we got it.
Technicians, don't I?
No. We got it.
Looked at audio down at the bottom and was moving the slider in it until you mentioned that. I'm glad somebody picked it up. Give them a free pass or something.
All right, awesome. Well, we got it. Okay, excellent. All right, so I guess Jane, did you have any other thoughts on sort of the Roswell aspect of? Because that's the first time I've heard this, and you do make a good point that no one has actually ever said, "Hey, was this thing a crash disk?"
So there were multiple. So the deal with Roswell is there were multiple accounts at different times at different sites. Basically assuming the same. I mean, there's even theories that there was multiple ships or discs that came out of the there's been a lot of elaborate theories because of how elaborate this whole event was. I like to propose the idea that maybe there was a Project Mogul going on, and what if the aliens crashed into our spy balloon, or what if we were expecting them like we do, like with the Tic Tacs and stuff. So I only think things too, though, Christian, about Roswell. I've just researched it a lot, like a lot of folks. So yeah,
I will say this, just because I have, especially more so after the whole Paul Bennewitz thing, when I began to realize, don't think whoever the powers that be are, they won't take steps, so to speak. They won't do something. The whole Roswell thing, I mentioned the Barney Barnett case. I think it was Barney Barnett, who was supposedly, or I may have the names backwards, on the other side of the plains of St. Augustine, who the story, that's all I know of it, was that he was out on his ranch and there was some other groups that came along the times when he came across some kind of crash with some of the bodies or the occupants there. Mm-hmm. And it strikes me that if something had happened over there, it's just like the magician who uses the distraction.
Sure.
You might very well want to focus people's attention on the Roswell area, especially if there was already maybe something that had been there, just to keep people, to just, a red herring, keep people away from it. I will say most of everything that I recalled initially came out about Roswell was from the book by Charles Berlitz and Bill Moore. And Bill Moore himself, of course, Bill Moore had a hand in the whole Paul Bennewitz thing. And I was there when Las Vegas, when he gave his whole speech at the end, and people kind of came unglued about it. And well, I have my own thoughts on Bill Moore if we get to talk to the Bennewitz thing later on, or even the other film that Ray took, which became a real hot issue last June when the SCU conference came out. Because my book is about two films, Paul Bennewitz and one that Ray Stanford had taken. And the reason I wrote on those two films was because both of them had ties to the Air Force Research Lab. It wasn't just I arbitrarily picked out two films that I thought, although they are each individually significant, they both tied into Air Force Research Lab. Paul was offered a grant, although it seemed to disappear and go nowhere. And then Lake Marabou, who had seen Ray's film, ends up working on his light craft out there, which There's so much more convoluted in this mess. But I don't want to discount Roswell just because, I
Well,
talked to
it's
Jesse
just
Marcel one time.
like you're saying, it's just it's part of the history. So understanding the Paul Benowitz case and the disinformation and or information, I guess, depending on your take. There's no reason to not use that information and apply it to Roswell. As I do think it's important context, and I think all your thoughts are very valuable. I think it's beyond an average Joe on the street speculating about it for sure. But yeah, I'm fine with diving into Paul Benowitz unless Rath or Lou, you guys have any Roswell?
No, I'm good with
questions.
Paul Benowitz.
Yeah.
I guess I'll start here with Paul. Is I think my knowledge of Paul is pretty surface level, if I had to admit. A lot of my interaction as far as the Paul Benowitz story is concerned is sort of the narrative we've got from Mirage Men. This idea that Paul was used as this mechanism to get out this UFO story, this alien base story, to cover up, to nefariously cover up tech. And in that process, he got pushed to the edge to a point where he alienated himself from his business, his family, and then eventually took his own life after being admitted a few times.
Yeah, I'm not certain. I've never heard any absolutes whether he took his life. I knew he was kind of in hospice care there towards the end, but
I'm just saying that this is kind of what the narrative that I think is in that film.
The question I was going to ask is, what was the proof that he took it? It sounds like there wasn't any proof that he took his life.
I've not heard that.
It only seems like a hearsay.
You haven't heard that? Am I crazy? Am I?
Oh, you haven't
heard
it?
Am I way off on this before? You haven't?
Well, yeah, I was listening to another documentary recently that didn't mention the suicide at all either. So I
interesting.
I think it might just be the Mirage Man kind of pushing that idea.
Yeah, it seems to have been a rumor that was picked up by different researchers, for whatever reason, but I couldn't seem to. There was never any like, because the coroner's report said this, or it was just, stated. So.
Well, I can give you my...
and then... I was going to say, again, this is kind of like our service level knowledge of the story. And then with Richard Doty on top of that being sort of the catalyst that pushed him over the edge and kept feeding them this, quote, bad information. But, after the short interaction I had with you on Martin's show, I'm like, okay, this guy's got a different perspective and I want to talk to him. So I'm curious to know, like, what is your perspective, especially after having, multiple phone calls with him, visiting him once, and having a much more intimate relationship than I think most people. So I'm curious to know
it's interesting to me because I can tell that I still have a very visceral reaction, because while you're talking, and it sounds strange, I admit, but I can just feel my skin tensing up because Paul had the goods. He had it in spades. And if nothing else, I was talking to my friend today, and we were actually talking some more about the whole Lou Elizondo thing, and the idea that when and I'll get to the Paul thing in a second, but to make my point, when apparently the OSAP thing back in 2008 became aware, the Navy and whoever became aware of it, and they wanted someone to go talk to the OSAP people, Bigelow's people, they didn't send a scientist. They didn't send a public relations expert. They sent a counterintelligence expert involved with security. Well, who did Paul Benowitz get handed off to? When Paul first called down to the base, he just called and got Ernest Edwards, who was in charge of the perimeter. The Manzano Mountains actually had a double perimeter electrified fence. Interestingly enough, you need to be aware, people say Kirtland Air Force Base, but most of that area to the east was Department of Energy land. But inside that was this 3 mile, basically 3 mile long strip of mountains, easily visible, even more so now because the housing area is moving right up towards it. That was electrified fence. That was the Manzano weapons storage area. And Ernest Edwards was in charge of the men that guarded that. Where Paul had been seeing these things coming down, and there's a reason why he got to that point. Yeah, that's kind of the view you would see from almost the main entryway to where Paul's little housing area was. But if you count those mountaintops, about the third one down from the left, the second one in from the very last tip, that's about 2.5 miles, 2 miles, 2.5 miles. Keep in mind, Paul's on the upper roof of a 2-story, it's like a very nice, expensive, ritzy, walled-in area. And so he's getting up on the very top of the roof. And I had an image I tried to kind of give you an idea of it, but you can go Google Street View and see basically where this was. So he's way up high looking over the fence. He's not just that view that I showed in that illustration.
Yeah.
And there's a reason he was there. But the point was where he saw these things, objects coming down and going down inside the double perimeter fence. So he calls and gets Ernest Edwards on the phone. Ernest Edwards puts him in touch with Richard Doty, hands him off to the counterintelligence guy. I actually went to Kirtland and sat and talked with Ernest Edwards and got a little bit more information from him on at least his role, although basically you have these guys who befriend Paul, and I have no issues with Ernest Edwards. I mean, at this point, you're military, you have to do what you're supposed to do. But, you know, even in the Mirage Men, there's a point in there, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, where Doty talks about Paul was somebody who hung the flag out and was very patriotic.
Right.
It's something to the effect that people like that are easy to fool.
Yeah.
Hmm.
I mean, that's not an exact parody, but in that same little clip of the conversation, I'm like, why would you, you know what? That's you and me and our parents. How would he feel if they were doing that to you? See, I mean, people need to have more value towards our ideals and not just this idea. I'm in the military and my job is, you don't do that. Okay. But needless to say, the point was Paul, and what most people don't realize is his wife saw these things too. At one point, he's out there on the, let me back up for a minute and you can interrupt me if you feel like it, because just explain how Paul ends up on the roof of his house in 20-degree or thereabouts weather. And the best I was able to conclude, it was about the middle of December, 1979, because he said there was no moon out and what the temperature was. And so I went back and checked the almanacs looking for about a time frame of a week, because I knew he'd seen these over a few days. But if you recall, way back in the 70s, cattle mutilations was kind of a big thing. It was an issue. You still hear some of it now, but it was blowing going. This is where Linda Howe got into it with a really good documentary back then. And a lot of other people, a couple of good friends of mine, Tom Adams and Gary, who were known all over the place. But there were also policemen up in the northern area, the Dulce area, you know, Gabe Valdez, these guys, and son Greg, who I've met. Well, even back at that time, there was a big hearing. FBI, I think the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, they had some hearings in 79 on, you know, the whole cattle mutilation scenario. And I think Tom Adams has sent me a list of people who had gone to this conference, and there's Paul Benowitz's name. I think he was actually kind of affiliated himself with APRO even at that point. But he had gone up there to this conference and had met Gabe Valdez. And somewhere around the middle of 1979, I guess he decided to go back up and visit that area. And he was taking a ride with Gabe Valdez. And Paul sent me actually a number of pages that I think he was putting together at the time, thinking of writing a book called, like, I think it was Hunter of the Gods, in which it described, the reason I kept these parts is because it described exactly all these details, right down to how he ended up on the roof. So this is Paul's own, you know, paperwork explaining all this. But when he rode around with Gabe Valdez, apparently they saw some unusual things. And he's like, we're driving around in the middle of the night with no lights on down these roads and on the Indian reservation land. And he saw some very unusual things that he was interested in. And over the next 6 months, I know at least 2 or 3 times, one time he even went with his son, where he talked about going back up there. And so he wasn't focused on Albuquerque. He was back up in the Dulce Archuleta Mesa area, which basically is why we hear talk of Archuleta Mesa and Dulce and underground bases. This is just because Paul was interested. And in fact, he saw some things up there that if you read the way he's written it, I've had people say, you know, it does sound like he was seeing some unusual things up there.
So was Paul Benowitz, was he the original, like, if you date the stories of Dulce, like, do we know which witness? Because, you know, there was Phil Schneider, and I want to say there's
right.
maybe been a few other people. Is he the first person who spoke of Dulce as having weirdness going on?
Well, I don't know if I
Let's
would say
say.
he's the first person. I would, because I'm not going to
I don't
discount the
know.
Gabe
Yeah.
Valdez and all the people who live in that area and the Indians who are there now. And for what it's worth, Avery Tafoya, who's one of the principal people in the Dulce area and who had invited me to speak at a Dulce conference a couple of years ago, and then the COVID virus blew everything up, and maybe it'll happen again this June. But I talked to him not too long ago, and people do see very unusual things going on up there. It's just because it's Indian reservation area, the rest of the world doesn't necessarily, get up to speed on everything that's happening. But because Paul rode with Gabe Valdez, who is a trooper, the policeman inside the Indian reservation area at the time, if I'm getting that correct, he rode around with him. And so Paul knew him, and I think Paul had known some of the people. And there was an area that Paul had some pictures I've recreated. I've shown them in the book that he took looking across a canyon towards the Archuleta Mesa area, where he had described seeing some very unusual things I can't even account for. But then another instance, he went with his son at night, apparently, because he even commented how funny it was hearing his son muttering, trying to get the camera to work while they're out there at night, seeing unusual lights coming along the face of the mountains, and the mesa and whatnot. Point is, Paul's interest is all up in there, in that area. And the last time he went, I think he went by himself. It was about to get cold because he made a comment about trying to get up there before the snow. Just by the way, that picture on the screen is my recreation. I make it clear in the text of what he would have seen looking towards that mileage range of the objects taking off, but it fits the description and I made it clear. The other pictures, as noted, are legitimate. And for what it's worth, the reason I have not put this in print is because I want the crispness of those illustrations that you can practically only get if you blow them up on a high resolution computer screen. I don't want it printed on bulk, pulp paper. I'm thinking about it again, but those are actual images. But needless to say, the last time he goes up there, when he comes back, his wife told him about an interesting episode that had happened while he was gone, where the dog woke her up barking really late, early morning hours, and she heard this loud buzzing, some kind of loud sound that seemed to be right over the house. And their house is really, so to speak, a stone's throw from the fence line in that image that I did. And Paul's thinking at the time, based on him having been up to Dulce, and he's really interested in this now, was he was curious. Well, wait a minute. Could he have drawn the attention of something while he's poking around up there in Dulce, or somebody who was curious about who the heck he was? And could they potentially have followed him back to where he's living? And, it's a reach, but needless to say, that was his mindset. So he decides maybe since he's home for Christmas holidays coming up, he'll just get up on the roof of his house and see what he can see. And it's in one of those first instances where he's on the roof of his house, and it's all described in the book. And this is what he wrote, where way off towards that mountain range one night, he sees these glows on the ground and he doesn't know what they are. And the first time he's watching them, and every few seconds, minutes, they brighten up and dim back down. And then all of a sudden, boom, his description is they lit up like an explosion. He said, you'd expect to hear the sound rolling across the floor, desert floor coming towards him. And these things just jump up fast. Flash comes on 300 feet up, shoot off around the end of the mountain, gone. Stunned him. So he starts going up there every night. He's up there looking because at that point, he'd never seen them come in. And in one night, and I was never able to determine from what he wrote if this was each night in a row, but at least I got descriptions of at least 3 times. So even if you figure it's in a week's time period when there's no moon out at night, and I laugh when I thought about this before, but nobody in their right mind is going to be standing on their roof in 20-degree weather in Albuquerque when there's no moon in December. And I've only known one other person to sleep outside who got good, and it was Ray Stanford, who happened to have the other picture. That's a whole different story. But needless to say, Paul, at one point, he's out there, and now he's got a Hasselblad camera. He's got another 8mm movie camera. He's got apparently one of them mounted on a telescope. And I'm like, boy, wouldn't I have loved to get my hands on those pictures? Although some of those may have been in the set that he sent me that I made the copies of. But his wife comes out one night. This was a peculiar thing. this is an interesting point. He at one point saw, when he's looking at the lights down there in the dark, what looked to him, he said, looks like a flashlight, somebody walking around beneath one of them with a flashlight, because you see the flat light playing across the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And then his wife came out at one point, and they saw what you would guess were the patrol jeeps, because there was a nice gravel road inside the perimeter fence around the whole periphery. And they had patrol jeeps, Ernest Edwards men that patrol the grounds. Where he's looking at these things that are down in the dark, and they see the lights of one of these jeeps. And he said it almost looked like, it was hard to tell whether it went underneath it or just beside it. But his wife was like, how can they drive right there and not see these things? But then he tells her, hang on, because he saw this sudden flash, apparently, if I recall correctly. Before they took off, there would be, although they would glow and brighten and dim, suddenly there'd be a bright flash. And then a few seconds later, poof, and he told his wife when he saw that flash, get ready, poof, off they go. So she saw these things out there with him. And the last time, which was really curious that I have in what he wrote, he apparently got out there a lot earlier, because he'd never been able to see them come in and land. So he got out there early to sit and watch. And it was later in the evening, but apparently before midnight, because what you need to understand, they didn't just sit down there for 15 minutes. These things apparently were sitting down there for hours at times in the dark. But he watched, and I don't know if it was just one object this time or more than one. He only described the one, where he was looking towards the mountains, and all of a sudden from the south end, one of these lights came in fast, and within like 5 seconds came up to this area, turned, went straight down, and the lights out.
Straight down into the base.
Wherever it landed down there in that area of the base. The point was not like he described, not like a helicopter would come around and then, hover and find a spot and you'd see it settle down. Apparently it was just around the end of the mountain, fast in. And I tried to measure the speeds, and we're talking Mach 1's practically speeds. I think it was interesting because I tried to do some measurements that to come in at that angle. I used to work for American Airlines, so I was kind of aware of the runway takeoffs and whatnot. But the radar is not going to necessarily pick up everything that's below the top of the little Manzano Mountains. So if we heard talk of Coyote Canyon, this is one of the things that eventually came up years later on, which is on the other side of the mountains from where Paul was talking, to the Department of Energy range. You go around that mountain and turn down that direction. I was never able, there were some reports of what they called a helicopter mechanic who had gone out that direction late one night and come across some lighted object by the last bunker on the left. And when he approached it, it took off. That's a story that we've heard. I had never had any actual factual basis for that. The only reason I mention it is because Paul's description wasn't that the objects just took off and kept going south, which would have been flat out over the desert heading south. They would seemingly go around the end of the mountain down there. Whether they were going around there for something else, I don't know. But if you looked at the maps and you looked at where they went down and the fact that they'd be down there for hours, that's why even in my opinion in the book, I had to pretty much decide. I have a hard time seeing some unusual, whatever you want to call them, just flying into one of the most secure areas. And it really was. The Manzano nuclear weapons storage area is what they referred to it at the time. One of the most secure areas in the country. And just sitting there on the ground and nobody would know it. But it's notable too that when Paul told them what he had on film, I guess you could say they went after Paul. Like, so maybe then he was the one who wasn't supposed. That's my take on it now, is he probably was not was someplace no one expected him to be, and to see those things coming in. And so they had to do everything that was necessary they could to defuse them. Because between you and me right now, I don't think that's just a UFO landing. That's somebody coming in, landing there. And interestingly enough, a friend of mine pointed out that Paul's description, by the way, it's not like these things were there was actually 3 smaller ones and a larger one. So you had 4 objects, but they didn't just all come in and land next to each other. They apparently seemed to be stretched out in a line. And from his description, if you compare them to where some of the bunkers were down that area of the mountain, those bunkers are about 200 feet or 200 yards apart. and it's speculation on my part, but you'd think if there was something going on in the bunkers or something being taken in or out of those bunkers, then you might want your objects landing in a line. Otherwise, why not all land together? Why land straight lines so far apart?
Right.
I don't know. A lot of that's just conjecture at this point but needless to say, I talked to Paul many times over the years. I mean, I'd phone conversations with him. He sent me, the information when I was going to give the conference or that talk at the MUFON conference in town. He sent me the box, and I took pictures of that for a minute, mailed it back to him. I actually was under the impression the way they were mounted, that those may have been pictures he had already mounted when he gave in November of 1980. There was a meeting down on the base, and he went down there and showed them a lot of this information. That's where afterwards somebody asked him if he'd considered putting in for a grant, but then you hear no more about it, and I don't suppose it ever actually occurred. But needless to say, everything that he told me, and when I talked to Ernest Edwards, none of them denied. I mean, none of them said nothing ever happened. The guy's crazy as a loon. Not a one of them at the time was saying that.
So
And
then let me ask you this: in your opinion, what was he filming? Was he filming something non-human intelligence or capability, or was he filming something terrestrial that the Air Force was very much aware about?
I think he was filming something the Air Force was very much aware about. Whether it was ours or whether it was someone else's, that's the big question. All I can say from looking at it at this point is what happened to Paul, and the fact that Richard Doty is still out there to this day, and he's being shown on the TV, and every time he does, he tries to drive another nail in Paul's story. Clearly, it was something extremely important that they did not want to get out for whatever reason. The fact that it sat down there for hours at a time and no guard shot at it, I mean, that's the job, right? Nobody, and if Paul, here's the other point. If Paul could see them when they would glow from his position on his roof 2.5 miles away, anybody closer who was looking would have easily seen them. For them to be there, and maybe for the lights to drive by that the wife couldn't understand why nobody, that suggests to me they were, let's just say, allowed to be there. That's just my take on it at this point. They were known to be there. They were allowed to be there. They were in there in the wee hours of the night on some of the coldest days of the year. I mean, who in their right mind is just going to go park themselves on the ground out in Albuquerque in 20-degree weather and sit there for hours? Unless you need to get there when nobody's going to be watching. And realistically, unless you were high up like Paul, if you were off at the airport or distance away and saw lights going around, they could say helicopters, and you could write that off as anything. But I think if you look at the images, especially when you begin to enhance them and you realize that the objects are down inside this glow. I mean, if anybody's ever worked with Photoshops and you've got levels that you can actually pick out the different brightness levels and you begin to thin out what's there, you'll find the objects, and Paul even had identified them as lenticular shaped, vehicles when they were sitting down there. Who built them? It strikes, I tried to make the point in the book, and this is just, I think it does make some kind of sense in the history of our capitalist society, where every defense contractor wants to come up with a new something next year so he gets more defense contracting money. And this was 40 years ago. Well, if they were flying around and flying in, it's like the Tic Tac. If you're flying around out there in the ocean and obviously it's not just test models anymore. You're not worried about it falling into the water. If they're flying around out there, then how many years would it take you to build, to engineer, to build? They would have been working on it for the 10, 20 years before that. And if you had that capability, something tells me we'd have seen. But then I say that and pause myself, because if it's that important, you might be doing everything you can to keep people from seeing it.
Right.
But something tells me whatever was there was allowed to be there. We knew it was there. The guards knew it was there. I had a friend who was in the Navy before. When I was talking, I just can't understand why the guards wouldn't do. And he said, these people have been there for years, guards for years. They are dedicated. If you tell them we've got something coming in, it's a classified project, don't do anything, ignore it, they'll do it. So it may very well be that the people who knew what was going on, or maybe maybe that's a cushy, assignment. You're right there in Albuquerque, and hey, you don't want to make waves and lose your job. So if they tell you to go indoors and sit for an hour, maybe you do it. I don't know. That's just conjecture on my part. But Paul, if you look at the images and you see the pictures he sent me, even the smaller ones, even if you go back and realize why he got interested in Dulcie, I forgot to mention this. It was because of a small Polaroid picture that he took when he was writing with Gabe Valdez. And before he left, he went to take this picture just to show his wife where they'd been. It was a picture of the Archuleta Mesa or a tree and some whatnot. And when he got back, his wife said, well, what's this thing right over here by the tree? And in that little Polaroid, there's something. I mean, I tried blowing it up and it can't prove anything from it, but it does not seem to just be a speck, an amorphous looking blob. There seems to be some shape to it. But that in itself got Paul very interested in what's this thing that was right there that he didn't see when he snapped the picture, but it shows up on the Polaroid. And that's what got him that much more interested in this whole phenomenon. And then to stumble into the photographs that he got and films and telescope. And, I have to just wonder if, it's notable to me that in the documents that came out with Jerry Miller, who had, keep in mind, Paul got these films way like at the end of 1979. It's not until 6 months later when suddenly a letter shows up at APRO, written by a guy, I believe the name was Craig Wetzel. And in fact, that letter appearing at APRO when it did and how it ended up getting into whose hands caused me to rethink this whole thing. But the point I'm getting at is, as long as Paul was talking to Ernest Edwards, my opinion, my thinking, as long as he's talking to Ernest Edwards, basically he's staying on the reservation, so to speak, at Albuquerque, and he's talking to Doty, and he thinks the Air Force is telling him, wow, what is this stuff? We don't know. And he thinks he's in on it and they're with him. He trusts them. Fine. But somewhere about April, May, June, Paul begins sending letters to Los Alamos, White Sands. My take on it is he starts going off the reservation. I honestly think he began to have suspicions about why nothing's happening when he's telling him this and nothing seems to be going. And then all of a sudden the Wetzel letter shows up at APRO, then eventually leads to Bill Moore. You got the stories of things happening and Doty comes into the picture. And then all of a sudden you've got talk. Now they're trying to, and Ernest Edwards even told me this, that after one of the meetings, very quickly afterwards, some of the big shots jump on a helicopter and fly up towards the Dulce area. Then you hear the talk of Paul having said that they flew him up there and they'd be pointing out, and I think even Doty has mentioned this, pointing out things on the ground that they're not sure what those are, planting the idea of underground bases, or is there something else? My feeling is do whatever you got to do to get Paul talking up there. So he's no longer, it's like Roswell, right? Get him looking back up here. Don't get him looking down at Albuquerque anymore and stuff him. Even Bill Moore at his talk in Las Vegas, when he revealed his part in this, said, it was like the whole idea was to stuff so much disinformation in him to diffuse him so that he would begin to talk about just.
Are there any accounts like Roswell suggesting that anybody was given information that, because you said it was like Roswell?
Well, I'm saying, Barney Barnett. You focus down here so that nobody's paying attention over there. You want Paul talking Dulce. You don't want him talking about Albuquerque. Because
this seems more like trying to get somebody to talk, whereas Roswell seemed like it was like trying to get everybody to shut up, right? And then many years pass. It's
there's the point. I honestly do believe it would be preferable to get everybody to shut up. It's like the Nimitz case. When it first occurred, nobody on the ship talked beyond that.
Before, because I know
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry for interrupting. I know we're gonna get into all this really good stuff, and before we move on from like the photographs and stuff, those are amazing photographs. I've never seen them before, so it's always fun to find like new evidence of, because I've known about this case, but I've never seen these. Have you heard the theories about these being like the first UAV drones ever? The description does not. Some things maybe I could see being advanced drones, but some things it doesn't sound like that at all. Have you heard those theories?
Well, and there's the thing. There was a long time ago, even Ray and I had talked about it, and he said, our own technology is starting to get so advanced, it's becoming harder and harder to tell the difference between, sorry, my monitor's moving. It's harder and harder to tell the difference between what's ours and what might not be ours. And and in reality, this is why, and I do this a lot, I will go back and think of the cases that I consider the rock solid ones. And I may only get to 5 or 10, but the way I look at it is, and I've told people this, I said, how many elephants does it take for elephants to exist? It just takes one. So all we need is, and we've got a lot more than one.
Right.
We've got really, really good cases that are almost just irrefutable unless you close your eyes and just refuse to even look, and there's kind of the thing. A good disinformation agent is supposed to muddy the waters so much or fill you with the idea that this is just some crazy guy. And I have actually tried to say some things about Paul Bennewitz on one of the old Facebook groups a while back, and you have somebody jump in. Well, everybody knows the guy was crazy. If all you ever read was some of the books like what Krista Tilton wrote, I would, and I'll be honest with you, by the time I talked to Paul, when he was talking about alien pragmatism and he was thinking he's communicating with them, although now over the last, after years, you begin to realize, wait a minute. So, and I'm not have factual basis for this, but this is what Greg Bishop even wrote, although he and I have a difference of opinion at the moment, but he implied in his book that Hynek had given a computer to Paul, but not to tell him that it was a computer that the Air Force had given Hynek to give to Paul to communicate with these aliens.
Right.
And you almost want to just...
What about the orbs flying around like in his room? Do you think that was later on that he was seeing?
I don't know what to say, but you'll notice that if you look at the end of the book, I have a addendum part about directed energy weapons and the fact that this kind of directed energy was actually being worked on at Kirtland. And the idea of, I go into it a little bit, and the point I'm getting at is Paul talked about these small little orbs of light that would at times appear in his house. And if they touched your skin, they'd sting. And actually, when I was working on the book, I was trying to track down any indication that other people had seen these. And of course, I think even Greg wrote in his book that Bill Moore at one point had been at Paul's, or I think it was Bill Moore, Paul's house, or maybe they had gone in. I think that was it. While Paul was gone, allegedly, Doty and some of the other people snuck into Paul's house. That's a whole different, what do you think of that? But underneath the staircase, saw one of these glowing little balls of light there, or somebody else had seen one. But I'm talking years ago, but I at one point happened to have been talking to Linda Howe back then, because she was in the midst of all of this back in that day. She was a central figure in 1980 when Paul Bennewitz was happening. She was working as a real good journalist doing things. And at one point I had asked her, she said she'd gone to Paul's house, or she'd met Paul somewhere. His wife was there. And she said on the arms, they had these little marks. And she asked them, what are the marks? Little scratch burn marks. And he said, that's where those little light balls touch you. And I'm like, holy schmoly. Now, the point I guess I'm getting at is speculation. What do you get if you were able, and you had, believe me, if you look at that appendix in the book, I did find some really intriguing points about a place at Kirtland called Scorpion Works, man-portable laser. The active denial weapons. There was a good book that came out, Active Denial Weapons, where it doesn't kill you, but it just gets into that top layer of your skin and makes you feel like you're on fire, and it'll clear the area fast. We see them now on top of like Humvees with a big antenna mounted up top. A lot of that stuff that was being developed right there at Kirtland.
Scary.
And I began to think, because there was some talk, Paul had talked about the houses across the street from him at times that he thought people coming and going. I have a feeling this is when he began to not trust that he's really getting the fair shake from the Air Force people. So I don't know how much was, honestly, I do think at some point he began to go off, go a little bit extreme, if you want to put it mildly. But the thought had occurred to me, if you were able to take some type of directed energy beam that by itself may not be notable, maybe you have to be able to shoot through a window, maybe however you want to do it, but you'll notice the same kind of thing that is now done in brain surgery where they're trying to get to a certain place. They project two beams that cross by themselves. Either one of them is not damaging, but where they cross does the work. Is it possible that what Paul's seeing in his house is somebody playing mind games with him by generating these little balls of light that they could get down there just enough to touch his skin and burn the crap out of the guy? And if he says anything about it, guess what? You all think he's crazy. But that's the whole point to me. The more you begin to paint the guy as crazy, or the more... I had a big issue with the episode of Unidentified that came a couple of years ago. They did one of those shows where they were talking about overflights over some of the nuclear bases here in the States and whatnot. And the first two segments of the hour-long episode, one of them was a base up in the north quarter somewhere, Idaho or somewhere up there. And of course, they bring the guy out who said, yeah, and they recreate the object as it was seen, and he's pointing the direction, the whole 9 yards. They go up, Chris Mellon goes on to go up there, and there's the witness. And they did a recreation of the object, right? So you can see where it was, what it looked like. But then the third one, they go to talk about Paul at Kirtland. No recreation, no even indication of these were the films he got that caused everything, why he called them to begin with. Just the first thing you practically see is clips of Russian military soldiers marching, and that's, had this problems with the Russians or whatnot, and that's what they were spying on the area or something to this effect. And the entire episode, I'm like, wait, if you're not going to have any indication that there was any UFOs around there, and you're basically going to just write it all off, why was it even the third segment of the show? Pick a different one. Pick one of the Malmstrom cases, pick some other case where you've got a UFO to show. Why put that on there and have Richard Doty and, sadly, in my opinion, and Greg Bishop basically come along and tag team and just say, Paul just called the base and said, hey, are you aware of these little lights? I'm like, look at the photos. And in fact, I had met Greg in Santa Fe and told him I'm disappointed. But the point was, why bring Doty on there and have him talk about the Kirtland incident, which all of this stemmed from, because Paul had these films, not show any indication of the actual UFOs or any UFO, but just make it sound like it was all some military, and then kind of just write off Paul as some crazy guy. Why even have it in? You see what I'm getting at, though? Here it is, 40 years later. They're still trotting this thing out to push this case down. And it may end up go away. If I die off, I may be the last one. I hope you guys will carry on. To me, this is not fair. This was Paul who thought he was doing the right thing when he called the Air Force. And his whole reason for calling them was because there was no response. No alarms went off when these objects are landing out there. And he thought maybe they don't know it. So he calls them to tell them, if you don't know, these things are down there. And the hit went on him. It didn't go, nobody, and for that matter, you could have told him anything. You could have said, hey, we're test flying some drones, or we're test flying whatever else, or we're doing whatever else, or, and in fact, I made what I thought was a good example, and then I'll shut up and you guys can talk, in the book of one of the guys that lived out near Area 51, who had been going around there and finding the motion detection little canisters buried in the ground, just so they could pick up somebody that was approaching the outer area, but it was on public land. And apparently he was becoming a thorn in their side. And one day he comes home to his trailer and there's the piece of paper stuck on the door and all of his equipment's gone. They raided him because he's for whatever, I guess it was just to prove the point, to get him to back off because he's causing them trouble. But that's how, if you think somebody is spying on your land or you want them to shut up, why not go? Why didn't they go to Paul and just say, this is a national security letter, shut up or else? You've got a company that has government contracts. You can either have all the contracts you need or never get another one. Why not? I don't know. But instead, the only reason I can imagine is to acknowledge anything at all was more than they could risk. So it's better to diffuse him by making him look to be a nut and then spend the next 10 years. And it really was. It was 10 years even, I think, before Bill Moore finally, so to speak, owned up and admitted that he'd been involved in it from the very beginning, that all of the stuff he was working on was because of Paul Bennewitz. And now, I guess, I don't know. But the same, I feel the same with Ray to the extent that I don't know if none of you are probably aware of the SCU conference last fall, the whole blowout that caused, all because, are any of you aware of that?
I'm not sure.
No, I didn't hear of an SCU fall. I want to hear about this, but I know Rather had a question, maybe regarding what you were saying earlier. What was your question?
Yeah, I'm just curious, what obviously Richard Doty or Paul Bennewitz was onto something real because he has such interest by Richard Doty and other people. And I believe Richard Doty has come out and said that, he was feeding all this disinformation because there was a legitimate secret that he was trying to obfuscate. Do you know what that secret was? I think I remember him mentioning it, but it doesn't come to my mind. But I do remember that it didn't necessarily explain the pictures at all. And it always seemed to be a little bit of a disconnect there.
Yeah. But, to me, this is the exact same situation we have today with UAPs and the threat scenario. Well, I can rationalize, and I think, Luis, you made the point that you come up with any argument, like in school when you're in a debate, both sides can come up with really good arguments to try to compel you to see their point of view. So if I were to come back and say, well, yeah, Paul had pictures of something, but it was really this legitimate secret, which I'm sorry I can't tell you about because it's classified. But it was this legitimate secret is what we were trying to keep from, okay, where do we go with that? You could pass anything off with that kind of an explanation. So if you want to call UAPs a threat, although I have an issue with even the term UAP, because that's just the safe way of now being able to confuse anything by saying it's a drone or it's a UAP. I mean, I had the issue, and I think I made this point in the book. Boy, I should go back and read my own book. I must have made some points in it. That originally, when we even heard the term flying saucer, which was kind of a misnomer based on what originally was reported, but the term flying saucer at least gives you a picture in mind of something. It's saucer shaped, it's flying. You have characteristics that you kind of identify. But then they switched it to UFO. And now anything goes, right? As long as I don't know what it is, it's fair game. Well, that gives, there you go. You launch Ancient Aliens and all the TV shows where they just talk about anything being now a little light. And I've even recently heard people described, yes, I looked out at this thing and at first I thought it was a star. And I'm thinking, okay, if I see something, I think it's a star, that means it's a tiny point of light out there. Either I can't figure out what it is, or maybe it's bright like Venus, but it's star size. It's a big difference between saying an orb, because orb imbues shape and form to it. I'm not saying, what Paul saw could have been called an orb, because it sounded to me like it was an actual light of some dimension inside there. But to call a UAP simply means, well, we can call them drones, UAS. We come up with all these acronyms that mean I don't have to really differentiate between that and something else. If I just call it a UAP, it's disposable. And I'm afraid we're going to have a lot of people these days who are just going to call it a UAP because it's the catchphrase. I don't necessarily have a better definition right now. I did try to come up with something. If we had a description that, because what I and my close friends talk about when we say, well, the real phenomenon that we're talking about, and then we try to make sure we're remembering the 5 cases that, and I could give you some, but the point is the ones that actually had characteristics: Socorro, Papua New Guinea, the Coin helicopter encounter, things that boy, you have definite shape. They drew the picture of it. You saw the whole 9 yards. You know it wasn't a balloon. You know it wasn't a dirigible. That sort of thing. So there's something to this, but it's too easy to dissemble, like by Doty saying, well, we had some legitimate. Well, of course, I have no doubt there's legitimate secrets out there at Kirtland. That's what they do. I mean, literally. So, but that doesn't, as James said,
and
that
I
doesn't
think
explain the pictures, the photos of what Paul
yeah,
said.
Lord Ludicrous Plaid. I think that this is what I was thinking about. That I think Doty was saying that he heard people talk about lasers trying to blind satellites, but yeah, that doesn't really explain those pictures, does it?
Yeah. This was another thing that was interesting because at Kirtland, and boy, if I can remember the name of the book, I'll mention it to you too. It had to do with the directed energy weapons, but it also had some background on this instance. There's a facility called the Starfire Optical Range. In fact, it's just about from where, you can check Google Maps, right? It'll show you. But from where Paul lived to the tail end of the mountains, about 3 miles, and just about that far on the other side, meaning it's not visible from Paul's side of the mountain, is where the Starfire Optical Range was. And this is what one of the things that they were doing there is also, it's an elaborate looking thing. You can actually see it in the Google, aerial view. You can actually see the domes and whatnot down there. But it was the Jason group. I'm sure one of you may have heard of this, intellectual guys. This group's called the Jason's group. And the Air Force had been trying to figure out a way to be sure they can focus very clearly up beyond the atmosphere, how to basically mitigate the atmospheric variations. And I may be paraphrasing this a little bit wrong, but at some point, some scientists told them, well, there is a layer way up there, I guess, towards the stratosphere of some element. I can't recall what it was now, but apparently if you hit it with a laser, it'll glow. And so they're able at that point then to create like a targeting spot that their flexible, however you want to call it, mirrors down below would then be able to know where the spot was and measure the fluctuations. You know how in a telescope you get the wind movements and whatnot, and correct for that. There's a term for it. I can't remember it right now. But the point was, what a beautiful technique, because now with that, they're able to actually make the mirror of the telescope correct for the sharpness of focus and see the satellites, take pictures of satellites out in space. Or on the front of these, the pictures we've seen of like the 747 that has the laser mounted in the front nose cone of it, and it's going to fire at rockets. Well, how do you make sure that miles out there where the rocket is, that your laser beams are now tightly focused there? If you focus at the beginning, they scatter. But by using, I wish I could recall the term for it now, but it's the idea that you measure the deflection and the interference in the atmosphere between you and that point, and you start out by correcting for it. So when your beam reaches that point, it's in focus out there, and boom, burns right through the weapon. So the whole idea of directed energy encompasses a lot of this. But Starfire Optical Range had apparently been using that. I don't know if it was a green laser, maybe it was green laser, which was one of the lasers they would shoot out of the facility, I believe, to create that glowing point that they could use then to focus their mirror on, to be sure that they would be focused once they got through the atmosphere. And I presume, I think you can even find pictures online now of pictures of showing that green laser firing out of the Starfire Optical Range. But it was, believe me, if you look at the pictures, there's no way to confuse a green laser beam with any of the objects that Paul filmed. And it's 3 miles on the other side from where Paul was anyway. You can't even see it from there. So at best, if they happened to fire a laser on that night, it would have been a laser coming up from, 5-6 miles on further away.
Let me ask, when it comes to Paul's wife and children, have you spoken to them about this post his passing? If so, how do they feel about sort of the narrative that's been shaped around, dad, husband, and have they sought recourse on this?
This is another one of those questions that gets my blood boiling. But
Okay. Well, I don't mean to do that. I'm sorry.
no, I'm fine.
Yeah.
This needs to be out there because I want Paul to be remembered for what he did. He deserved better.
Yeah.
To answer that question, and in fact, I'll go back and give you a little bit of story of the last time I actually spoke with Paul. To answer the question first, I've never had an at-length conversation with his wife or kids to really be able to have back and forth. Still possible. When I drove to Santa Fe the last time, I just cold called, walked into Thunder Scientific, and I believe it was his son, Ben. I just went in and asked if I could speak for just a moment, and I wasn't there, 5 minutes. I just stood for just a moment, just to pay my respects, I guess you could say, and to tell him that I always had a lot of respect for his father. And he was very polite, very nice to me. I mean, they didn't throw me out or anything like this. But it wasn't a situation where I could really go in and ask questions.
Right.
But I had been communicating with Paul, and this is back in the mid to the latter part of the 1980s. I'd been communicating with him, and this irritates me. Talk about a screw up. Okay, this is the way I'm angry at myself for this. And in fact, it involves John Lear. Somehow, because of a conference that we went to when we did a news thing in Washington, D.C., I could probably look up the date on it, and Phil Klass had challenged Dale Gowdy, and Dale Gowdy called me up and said, "Hey, you want to go up and talk about the documents?" And okay, so and there was a MUFON conference anyway, so we got there the day before and did this thing. And John Lear shows up with Dale Gowdy. All right, seemed like a terrific guy at the time, right? I mean, it's John Lear, William Lear's son. I will tell you, John's a very warm and entertaining guy. If I was just going to hang out with somebody, he's a blast. He called me one time when he was flying halfway over the Atlantic he calls me from the cockpit. I don't know what the hell, right? But I could tell, yeah, well, when he came back to Dallas one time, I met him. He brought me a bottle of Crown Royal. Very nice guy. All right. At one point, he wanted to go meet Paul Bennewitz for whatever reason. There's more to the story. Won't need to go into that. And I had talked to Paul, and I said, I mean, I can't stop anybody. I couldn't stop any of you if you knew where Paul lived to go knock on the door, right? It's not my business to speak for Paul. And I told him, I said, this is John Lear. I mean, I just met him. I hadn't known him a few months, but I can't say do or don't to anybody. And I think at the time, even Paul was like, fine, John Lear, right? And have him come in. John Lear was becoming a character in the field at the time, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And there were things at the very beginning that I was curious about, but needless to say, okay, fine, I'm doing my own thing. Apparently, John went to Paul's house, and I guess may have ended up spending a couple of days in Albuquerque at the time. I don't know what was said, but I got a call from Paul a day or two afterwards, or sometime afterwards, maybe a week afterwards. And he was livid. I mean, angry about, I was like, Paul, I'm like, it was all I could do to say, look, I don't know. I've only met John, in the past for a little while. I don't know. I did not bring him to you. I didn't, I can't stop him. Paul was angry because the best I could tell, and I think I mentioned this in the book, it was something that John was either said he would do or was going to do. I don't know. And it didn't come out. Paul was pissed off, to put it mildly. And then it was very shortly after that, a week, two, Linda Howe calls me and says, have you talked to Paul recently? I said, well, yeah, I just talked to him a week ago. And she goes, his phone number's been disconnected and changed to a private number. I'm like, wait, I was sure, okay, he'll return my call. I mean, I was hands down positive. So I called the number, but it's like put into a private thing. I tried to get in touch with him any way that I could. I was sure he'd call me back at some point. Never heard from him again. I'm guessing that it was somewhere along that line that maybe the family felt they had to do some kind of intervention. Maybe he had just gotten so stressed out that they felt the only way for, I don't know. I mean, I'd be making it up as
Could I
anybody
ask
trying to
you,
understand.
when you talked to him and he was emotional and angry, what was he saying? What was he angry about?
That's exactly it. To this day, all I remember was me telling him, Paul, hey, I don't speak for John. I don't have anything to do with John. I did not tell him to go visit you, and I don't want to be held to account for John. I mean, I was backing up is basically it. He was so mad at the time, but I think at the end of the conversation, it was like diffused. It was like, well, okay, no problem. But
he was venting to you, or was he also angry with you for introducing them?
No. I did not get the impression. He was angry at me at all. I think he was angry and he was calling to vent. And maybe, I don't know what John said to him. I don't know what was discussed.
But he was upset with John.
He was upset with John. And the best I could tell and that I recall was either John was going to basically introduce him to some other people John knew, something John had either said or promised, whatever, that he was going to do. And then when it went back, it didn't occur. And I guess Paul felt used, backstabbed, just pissed off. I don't know. It was just, honestly, I remember when he was so mad at that point, I was in shock a little bit, because why was he'd never, ever been angry when I talked to him. He was always very low key, talking, drone on, kind of thing. So for him to be angry, I didn't know. What was it he was, I don't even remember if I talked to John about
I was going to say, have you ever spoken to John Lear since that conversation?
No. I mean, there was a situation that arose, and honestly, for the life of me, a lot of this stuff was within a span of a few months. So when I was writing the book, I was trying to decide, wait, my memory, this happened before that, or that happened before, because I would not have done this if that had occurred.
Right.
There was one thing that occurred with John, and I feel like a broken record here, but this is the thing that made me even tell John, I can't associate with you at all anymore. And it was back in those days, you can probably still find it if you check the internet. There was a letter or a memo called O.H. Krill, Krill, O.H. Krill memo. It's now part of ufological, mythology, or whatever. But back in the day, it just started circulating, and nobody really knew where it came from. But it supposedly was I don't even remember all the details, a page or two of this story of an alien that had been held hostage. And from what I know now, the OH was supposed to stand for Original Hostage Krill, but it was held hostage by like the military or whatnot. For what it's worth, the first I think most people are going to really find about John Lear was he began with some involvement with Bob Lazar. But needless to say, John had burst onto the scene, and this O.H. Krill memo got out. I didn't know anything about, I didn't even really care much about it because there was no provenance for what it was. Just another one of those things. I had gone to Vegas at one point, just happened to go and was going to visit John, and was at his house. Wonderful house. Horses, tennis court. Boy, don't we all wish we had a place like that. Very gracious guy. Nice office space. We're talking, and he was talking about, and I want to say Bill Cooper. I need to go back and double check who was the main people around at the time. Yeah.
Bill Cooper. That sounds about right.
We might.
Yeah, and this is
let's
what.
keep our YouTube video up.
Yeah, and I mean, I wasn't into any of those kind of guys. Phil Schneider, whatever, right? But I know who they are. Well, right. John comes up with this story where apparently one of the TV crews was interviewing, and I'm thinking it was Bill Cooper, because that's the name that comes to mind. Used to be in the Navy, some guy anyway, at John's house. And they asked John, he was asking them about some things, and Bill Cooper claimed, I may be paraphrasing, but you'll get the point. Bill Cooper claimed that he had seen the O.H. Krill memo back when he was in the Navy.
Hmm.
Wow. During a break, and this is John standing 6 feet from me in his home, says, during a break, he called Bill Cooper over and said, why did you tell them that you had seen the O.H. Krill memo when you were in the Navy? He's like, because I did. And John says, you couldn't have, because so-and-so and I made it up. And there was a guy, I don't remember his name now. I don't think it ever came to be anything. And believe me, same look on your face was on my face when I'm looking at John thinking, first, why would you do that? And secondly, why would you admit it to me? He says, yeah.
So is this in front of you? You're seeing
Yes,
this exchange?
in his house.
And then what did Bill say to that after he said he made it up?
Well, no, my apologies. Let me make sure I clarify. Bill
Sorry,
Cooper was not there at the moment.
Okay.
I had gone to visit John, and I'm talking
crazy.
to John. Yeah, I'm talking to John, and John's telling me the story that he had been at John's house with a TV interview. How he ended up at John's house, I have no idea. This was some time before I was there, and John just happens to be bringing it up. If I'm not mistaken, John may have been holding a copy of the Krill memo at the time, but my point is, he's 6 feet from me in my face. John talking to me, like laughing, like this is, well, it's a good one. And Bill Cooper apparently made the statement he had seen that memo when he was in the Navy. And then John, during a break in the interview, says, yeah, I called Bill over and I said, why did you say that? And Bill's like, because I did see it. And John's like, you couldn't have, because this guy, the best I remember now, and I think this is in the book, this is what John told me. It was a guy who wanted to break into the UFO lecture circuit.
Wow.
And thought the Krill memo, knowledge of this thing would be the ticket. So
wow.
He and John.
He also is the one that said the MJ-12 documents were forged and part of disinformation.
Believe me. Now that you bring up MJ-12, I'll give you another episode.
Because there was also Project Aquarius. So, like, I wondered if could you get into? Do you have some knowledge around the files that Paul
Project
claimed
Aquarius?
to have been leaked?
I know a little bit about.
Yeah, and then
I did some FOI requests on that, and they wanted $15,000 to any information on Project Aquarius. I mean, I'll give you that here in 2 seconds. That's actually when we met John in Washington, D.C., the first time I met him. My friend Tommy Bland and I and Dale had gone to Washington to do this because Phil Klass was claiming some of the documents, I don't remember which ones, were forged, and they weren't. But John happens to come in, and here's John with Dale. This is when John burst onto the scene. This is my take on it. People can believe what they want.
What year was this around?
This
was like early 90s, I'm thinking?
Nope.
Late 80s, maybe even?
And I could be mischaracterizing the MJ-12 stuff because it gets really confusing.
Yeah, it was a UFO conference that took place in Washington. There was a MUFON conference in Washington, D.C. It was, I guarantee you, it was before 89 because that was when Bill Moore had his big come to Jesus moment in Las Vegas, and he admitted about Doty and all of this stuff. And Bill Moore basically left the scene forever after that, by most accounts. Bill Moore was in Washington at the time of this conference. So it was between 85 and 89, one of those Las Vegas. I mean, it was a MUFON conference. And if you go back, even on the QFON website, I think the Aquarius documents may be what it's called, because that's, I think, the documents that Phil Klass was arguing about, and that's why Dale Gowdy was promoting them. And in fact, I honestly think now a lot of this stuff is red herrings. They put it out there because it divides and conquers, and all ufologists scattered doing FOI requests. Right. But the MJ-12, and does anybody even remember to this day that MJ-12 originated with Paul Bennewitz? Does anybody even knows? You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Nobody. No. If you read the book, you'll notice. I'll give you why. It originated with Paul Bennewitz
to him, correct?
Through Richard Doty.
Yeah.
But oddly enough, supposedly it was called they called it the NASA telex at the time, although subsequently
and
the story came out.
Also was the other one,
the story came out that it was NSA Bill Moore had gotten it. Bill Moore had claimed that Bill Moore had claimed that Richard Doty had given it to him to give to Paul, allegedly hoping Paul would run with it, and then it would be He cut him off at the knees, so to speak. Bill claims that he told Paul, I'm not sure about this, so don't do anything. And Paul didn't. To his credit, he sat on it, if you want to call it that. But you'll notice that that's the first mention of MJ12. And in fact, if I recall, it's written out. Big difference between MJ-12, which became an acronym everybody uses, and in the original document, it's spelled out MJ, the 12, the number 12 written out. Now, first off, why would you let out a legitimate classified program so secretive? Why you could have made up anything. You could have made up Joe Below 12, and it would have worked if no one knew. But you put it in there in this particular context, and you wanted to give it to Paul Bennewitz, it never comes out. And then I think 3 years later, suddenly Bill Moore and I think Jamie Chandray are claiming Bill Moore again. Jamie Chandray claiming, if I'm not mistaken, they get a roll of film that's delivered to Chandray, and in there are these MJ12 documents, and it, boom, becomes a huge thing. I guess if Paul didn't say anything about it, they use it again, shortly thereafter. But the point was, back to John Lear, we're in Vegas. John had come up to the room and had made some comments even then about things that I thought, my friend Tom Dale, we thought this is just a guy who's an enthusiast, and now he's come along, and I give him credit. John apparently can fly more airplanes than I've ever seen any. When I was at his house and he pulled up his wallet and went, all the flight certifications for things. Holy cow, that impressed me. But he shows up in Vegas, in Washington, and he made some comments about things he knew that gave us pause. Like, does this guy know more than he is, or is he really a clueless newbie at this time? Later, but no problem. Just met him, whatever. We're sitting in a conference, in an audience thing, and I think it's Bill Moore up on stage talking. A few minutes later, Bill asks some question or brings up something about MJ12. John stands up right there in front of everybody. And John's like, I heard about MJ12 through friends of mine, and boom, John became a figure. You can imagine we're sitting in this chair looking at each other going, what the just happened? Because suddenly John was made a name for himself. I mean, Lou Elizondo to the max. Just popped out of nowhere, became a big figure, knew about MJ12. Right there, Bill Moore. And it wasn't till years later, when the addendum in my book it caused me a year of waiting to write about it, where I talk about Lima Site 85 in Laos. When I realized, wait a minute, and there was a book written called The Most Secret Place on Earth about Lima Site 28, a CIA secret base in Laos. And later on, turns out, isn't it interesting? This is a place that John Lear apparently flew in and out of, because he had a picture of it on his wall in his office. And I found out about it because of a connection to Richard Doty. And I spoke with a guy who was the commander, Colonel Clayton, commander of this mountain in Laos. That was a hell of an intriguing story in itself. The fact that I could never put them both at the same place at the same time, but I found on History Channel, and I tried to dig it up. I have some records because I wrote Doty and asked him about it. We're at a place on History Channel under the discussion board way down deep was an email address that Richard Doty was using, and he's talking about having been at Lima Site 20A when Lima Site 85 was attacked. I'm like, wait a minute. This all happened in the late 60s. According to Doty's story in his books that have been told where he joined the Air Force and all this stuff, how the hell old is he? So either it's stolen valor, he's claiming to have been there, but I started digging into it, and that's when I realized Long Tien, the place that John has a picture on the wall when he flew for Air America back then, landing at this Lima site, same place Doty's talking about having been. Nobody should have been there. It was a CIA base.
Can I ask real quick, how did you know that picture on his wall was the actual base that he was flying over?
Because he told me. And in fact, I think there were John was a speaker at an air, pilots club. I think it's all outlined in the book. I promise you, I think it's all spelled out in there, where he had gone and given a talk, like the Air America pilots had talked about this, and named Long Tien as a place he'd been. and had a picture. And I remember even, and I think there may have even been a picture that he had posted online where you could see standing behind him. There was this picture of Long Tien, this base.
Do you
on the
think
wall.
why do you think he would show you that picture or tell you things like, I made up the Krill document? I guess I'm kind of because you said you kind of had a vibe about him, like maybe not trusting him. But do you think he was giving you accurate information in these cases? Like he was showing his true colors to you? Do you think he could have been manipulating you? Like,
Believe me.
I'm giving you information, so like we're buddies now, kind of?
Yeah.
Jane, you're sharp. At least you're hitting me on the questions that I would ask, because, but I don't as far as why he would, to this day, why he would tell me that he had helped this guy make up the Krill memo. I stood in his house. I stood in his house right then, and I said, John, I can have nothing more to do with you from this point on, because I can't just go along, wink, wink. What if he comes out later on and says Lambright knew about it and we all laughed? I have my own integrity I'm caring about. I take this matter seriously. I want you to know that if I don't know, I'll tell you I don't know. If I do know, fine. I'm not going to lie to you one way or the other. And I would rather say, I'm not sure, I think, so you'll know I'm not making claims for things I don't.
Yeah.
But I can't stand with John. You're known by the company you keep. Up to that point, maybe he did know some things about MJ12. I had no evidence to prove or disprove it. I still say to this day, he's a nice guy, very entertaining guy. He was never cross with me. He was nice, but
it seems like he's got a couple of examples of just being a liar or deceitful at the very least.
Why? I thought to myself, like Jane was asking, what might have been accomplished by admitting that to me? The whole term in espionage, spy, is compromat, compromising information. If I had done nothing and laughed it off and said nothing, could it have come back later and said, you went along with this stuff? I don't know. All I could do at that point was just cut ties completely. Right. I wish him well. I don't want that sort of thing. But I'm not a guy who has admitted to me to my face. Was it stupidity? I don't know. Why would somebody?
It could have just been the duper's delight. Wanted to. Was kind of thought it pleased him that he got away with telling a lie and wanted to share it potentially.
Yeah, I don't. Maybe he just thought it was a funny thing. I have, unfortunately, I don't know. Psychologically, look at the last year and a half in this entire country. Explaining people's mindsets, what people decide to believe is a fact. Well, there are no facts. There's evidence. But if I decide I don't like the way you're interpreting it, or I want to interpret it some other way, now you have people who we can all believe whatever we want. That's why I really had a lot of respect for the recent, I guess it was Avril Haines came out and made this comment about trust in this country, that there's so much, even in the intelligence community, documents are classified, and if you look into how they sidestep and go around giving you what you want. I filed FOI requests. Project Aquarius was one I filed. I was going to follow up on that years ago, just to find out. And I get a letter back from the NSA, and they say, because I start with, I want everything you've got. And they said to look in and find everything we might be able to get on Project Aquarius. It'll cost you $15,000. And when you send us the first half, we'll start. So I wrote them back, and I said, wait, okay. I'll tell you what, send me just the first originating document that lays out the purpose. A few pages. It'll be under that $100 limit or whatever they give you, right? So I wrote them back and I said, okay, all right, I don't have $15,000. So I'll just change this and say, just send me back the originating documents that outline the whole premise of Project Aquarius. The reason they got that I knew they had something was I had actually mistakenly requested 3 things in the same letter. One was a project, I think it was Snowbird, if I'm not mistaken. Oh, yes. There was another project name and Project Aquarius, any and all information on them. They come back and say, on the first 2, we have nothing. On Project Aquarius, it'll cost us $15,000 for a search. All right. You pretty much, maybe I got lucky, right? I caught them in a catch-22.
Oh my God.
Then when I wrote them and said, all right, just send me the originating document. Then they write back and say, all information relating to Project Aquarius would pose a grave damage to national security. So you got nothing. I'm like, they couldn't tell me that the first time. Maybe I'd have sent them a check for $7,000. But the point was, then they turned around and pulled the grave damage thing, which that was why it was so coincidental when I think I don't understand this one either. In the last year or two had written to O&I requesting all the information on the Nimitz investigation and the videos. And they come back and say, all of that would pose grave damage to national security if it was released. Whoa, that was a shocker because I'd only ever heard that once before. Go ahead, Jane. You have a question?
No.
She was about to say something.
Just like, but so $15,000 would be worth the national security threat? It seemed like it would,
no.
Were
they
they
were trying
just
to hope.
knowing you would never pay it? Is
Of course, I think so.
basically
That was
the
the kiss
whole
off, right?
plot?
The point
Yeah.
is,
Would they give you the money back if you paid it and then they said there's nothing there?
Never mind. Never
Yeah.
mind.
I have a
Yeah.
feeling what they'll do is they quickly go in and the first two they say, we got no hits on that. Holy moly, Project Aquarius. So to do because I was asking for all records in any form, whether it's a video, you try to come up with a wording in FOIA that you catch them at it. They can't dodge you. And so they come back and say, to do a search for all those records will cost estimated $15,000. And I'm like,
I see. Like,
now, does that mean
function
there's
of
so
it.
much or it's so disparate that they're going to have to just hire 100 people to start looking? I don't know. To me, it was clearly a dodge. It was just, all right, pay me $1 billion and we'll look. They knew I didn't have it.
Did you, somebody asked, did you file an appeal?
Not after the grave damage thing. I figured it. Now, I will honestly say this. Now, all these years later, when the O&I denied the Nimitz investigative materials, which was a surprise to me. I had gotten this email back. My friend Jim Klotz, who runs Government Attic website, which is an FOI thing par excellence. I mean, I highly recommend it for records. He and a buddy has set it up years ago. So I go to him and I say, hey, what would you do with this? How would you word this request? So he's been very helpful. But immediately afterwards, when they denied the request with grave damage, national security, whatever, you file, a review for it. You file all this sort of thing. Then you sit and wait.
Right.
Sit and wait. I mean, I got there immediately. I have a feeling they must have been primed for someone to ask that, because in all honesty, and even John Greenwald has acknowledged this, you file a request and then you wait a year and maybe they'll say, hurry up and wait.
Right.
But it was like a month and a half or two. I mean, I admit I was surprised. I thought, whoa, when I asked for that information that way, they immediately shot back grave damage. They did say there was a video that I think had either been shown or there was the property of the Naval Air Warfare College, NAVAIR. So I pretty quickly filed immediately for that one as well. What it was, I don't know. Although later on, I even wrote to them and said, look, by the way, is this the Fleur video that we've all seen now? If so, then fine. We'll just, I don't need to see, whatever else. And they just send you back and thinking, we're still working on your request. So I don't really know what it was or what's going to come from that. But now it's been, a year, and you still sit and wait. But honestly, the whole trust issue, even John Greenwald had the other day filed something.
I mean, it's part of the reason why we're petitioning local state representatives to pay attention to this more, because we feel as their constituency, they've got a very golden opportunity to gain trust from the American people. And they don't have to be 100% honest on this topic, even if they're only a little bit honest. I think you could see, and I don't know how you feel one way or the other about the Lou Elizondo story or the whole New York Times expose and article. But since that time, science is, now we've got, and we haven't even heard about the story at the SCU, but you got the Galileo project, you got projects like UAPX, these independent researchers that are now looking for these answers and using some really sophisticated equipment to try and get some of those answers. You've got politicians on just in the last week, Andre Carson had 2 different town halls where he said this could be extraterrestrial. That's coming out of a sitting congressman. So I feel like when they're even a little bit honest with this topic, it's a golden opportunity for them to win some more trust. I mean, how do you feel about that? Is that a waste of my time? Do you think that's something worthy of pursuing?
You should never give up the fight. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's another famous quote, and believe me, I know I'm known for spitting out quotes, something to the effect that all that's necessary for evil men to conquer, to succeed, is that good men do nothing.
Right.
My feeling is you at least want to have stood up for something.
Right.
Even when other people are saying, don't make waves, don't do this. And I admit I tend to say things people, I guess, don't want to hear, or I don't go along with the status quo, feel good, woo-woo disclosure crowd thing. But not that I don't want it to happen, as partly it's like, been at this a long time,
Mm-hmm.
and you've seen it come and go, the waves roll, then it's a big wave, and then it dies, then a big wave, then it dies. And you almost begin to become aware of, I'm convinced, I mean, it's just my thinking process trying to be logical, that there is some set of people, a group, whatever you want to call it, people I talk to, we tend to refer to them as the watch committee, because that name has come up some other places. The point is, even I realized the first time I went to Socorro, and I stood there and thought, look, I'm paying my own way here, my own gas money, my dime, my research, my phone bill. Back then, boy, your phone bill was through the roof. And I can get to that point, and I am convinced beyond a doubt that Lonnie Moore is telling me the truth, that he saw what he saw. All the other documentation bears it up, just like when you see Fravor talking, and then you hear Alex Dietrich talking, and maybe I was just lucky, but I had some communication with Douglas Kurth, who was out there before they were, and who was actually the first hire at Bigelow Aerospace before the name Bass was registered. And I found out, how did he end up there? I mean, I was lucky. He wrote me back a few emails. He was aggravated, made me feel like but he did respond and cleared up some things that tell me I don't have any doubt at all that they saw what they saw. I don't know.
When you say they, you mean Dietrich and Fravor?
Yeah, Fravor and those people. I don't have any doubt. So the point is, yes, there's believable information out there on this kind of thing. But do I really think that the people that all this time, I mean, I don't know how old y'all are, 30 years old.
I'm a little older than that. I'm just saying 42 this year.
The people that have been keeping the lid on this since way back in the 60s, are just suddenly going to roll over now.
Right.
Let me make this observation.
I don't think they have to roll over. I think they could, again, they don't have to be 100% honest with this, but they could release information that maybe changes science, changes society, confirms things one way or another. It's almost kind of like, the space program, right? People don't fly space shuttles to work, but there are a lot of technologies and things that came out of the space program that are deeply embedded into society now that we could not live without. So I feel like, part of this, and I'll I guess disagree with you a little bit. I think this is a little different only because from a political standpoint, there hasn't been this much movement in a very, very long time. And also we've got the internet, we've got social media, we've got we've got YouTube, we've got forums to discuss this topic in a way that we've never been able to do before. And now we can challenge things because it's not the 90s where somebody stands up in a conference room and says, oh yeah, those documents, yeah, they came through me. Oh, is that right? Okay, well, let me Google that. That didn't exist back then, so
right.
I feel like
Lou, this is what I told you on Martin's show, that I liked you so much, your enthusiasm.
Right.
But the idea
I'm trying to leave you some hope before we end the show.
No, and I don't have any problem with you disagreeing with me. I actually don't think we disagreed on anything.
No,
I agree with you.
I'm not saying disagree. I'm just saying
my point is
on what we think might happen or why it's different.
But there is let's put it this way. I would have been willing to hear if there was some reason what went on with Paul Bennewitz had to be that way. I mean, first off, I'm not anti-American at any, and yeah, if there's a technology out there, I'd much rather our democratic society have it at least first, so we're protected before. Okay, I get all that. And believe me, I spend a lot of time, my friends and I get into our heads a lot analyzing what might happen if suddenly this just blew out there. Well, there are some seriously bad people who would take that technology and turn it against us. So you don't want that to get to Al-Qaeda or whoever else. Okay, so I get it. You're right. You may not need to be telling every little detail, but even you would know there's a point that you need to have enough of the truth that you feel you got a good grasp and that they were honest with you.
Right.
At this point, this whole trust issue, I'm not sure that I believe, and the whole business with what became, what turned into To the Stars and led us to this day. I'm 95, 99, I'll give myself % convinced this is an op. There was something else going on. This is not what we're told. I mean, for that matter, and I don't want to go into this, but if any of you have had a chance to look at the recent video that came out by a guy up in Portland somewhere called Who's Lou?
Yeah, I watched it. We're going to talk about it.
It's about 2 hours long. It's about 2 hours long. So, but believe me, the questions he raised.
When was Lou Elizondo born? I tried to look that up the other day and I couldn't find it.
According to this guy, he was born in the United States, in Maryland or somewhere.
But usually you get a nice little Wikipedia born, and I couldn't immediately find out.
Yeah, I don't.
Well, God, boy, did you just open a can of worms right before the show ended?
Maybe I'll find out when his
the point is, whoever did this show put a lot of work into it. This wasn't something they whipped out in a month or whatever. This took serious tracking. There's questions about it, things he's brought up. But to me, it's even beyond just there. Well, back in 2019, I was in Austin at the time, and I just sat down one day and started looking at the questions and all this that didn't add up. Are you in Austin?
I am an hour away, and I was raised in Austin. I was just there. So, yeah, my family's in Austin, so I'm there all the time.
Yeah, a good place when you're young like you. I mean, but I was up in the Wells Branch area, but it was terrific. I mean, it was a nice place. But the point was, at the time, I sat down and started just writing down all these questions I had on things that didn't add up. The first even like, wait a minute, how did Kurth, the original pilot, before Fravor was out there over the disturbance in the water, Kurth was out there. How'd that guy suddenly end up working for Bigelow Aerospace? All right, start there. Then go back and say, wait a minute, if he was out there first, why don't we hear from him? Why isn't he every bit as worthy and interesting pilot to hear from? And then it began to, things didn't add up. Wait, this narrative we're told was he got called off and he left. But then how could he have seen the disturbance disappear unless he was still right around the area after Fravor's encounter? It all built into a long series of questions. I wrote this 20-page, and then things began to unwind involving Tom DeLonge and Kit Green and Hal and a lot of this Bass information. How did the DIA get it? And then I wrote 2 more articles that I had on my website. And even Keith Basterfield, I was talking to him a lot at the time, and one of the last ones that I wrote revealed a whole lot of information and never heard anything about it. Even though Keith Basterfield people didn't pick up on, for example, we're told this whole story that a guy from the DIA, we're told it's Lukotsky, had contacted Bigelow about Skinwalker Ranch. And then Bigelow contacted Harry Reid, and then Harry Reid and Bigelow worked out some arrangement to get $22 million. But something to do with, it started with Skinwalker Ranch. Although then it turns into a UFO program once the 22 million is kicked in. But then I have it from someone who was there, and I've got the email, that Harry Reid told Bigelow about the Nimitz case in 2005. But they didn't do anything.
Dang.
They sat on it until suddenly in 2007, boom, you hear Hal even saying it all started in, I think, June of 2007. Now, wait a minute. This is over a year before the OSAP contract came out and near the end of 2008. Why would they sit on it to begin with? But a person who was there, because he was told by
sit
Bigelow.
on it, do you mean, when you say sit on it, do you mean not released publicly?
Yeah, my point is this. If it was suddenly a big deal in 2005, how come we didn't have the Bass contract starting in 2005?
Right.
The way it was worded was, for whatever reason, Bigelow just put it in the back of his mind. Or apparently, though, nothing happened. But then all of a sudden in June of 2007, poof, now all of a sudden Hal's writing the proposal. This is according to, I think, Eric Davis, who said it in an interview, that Hal's working on the proposal for Harry Reid's, but wait, the contract wasn't going to come up until August of 2008 when the DIA finally put the contract out. So somebody's planning over a year ahead of time. And all of a sudden, the next thing you see, Kurth, who was a Nimitz pilot, but no one had known anything about, Kurth shows up hired at Bigelow Aerospace. And I got this from his LinkedIn page. He's suddenly hired to work at not Bigelow Aerospace, but Bass. Bass was like a subsidiary company, but it wasn't even set up legally until I think January of 2008. But Kurth is hired in November. I talked to Kurth, email exchange, found out once Kurth left the service, because he was a Marine pilot, Fravors Navy, but they were both on the Nimitz doing their mock-ups. Kurth leaves the Navy, moves back to his family area in Arizona, I think. And then for personal reasons, whatever, moved to Las Vegas in the beginning of 2007 and begins applying for jobs as a mission control specialist with Bigelow Aerospace. And he said he applied several times, and then all of a sudden, somehow he gets hired, but he's going to work at Bass, which was the OSAP. And keep in mind, Bass is the subsidiary that was actually, I think, my opinion, run mostly by Hal as the subcontractor at EarthTech. And Hal wrote the proposal to win the contract. But so Kurth is hired more than almost a year, let's say, not quite more than a year. But before all this gets started, Hal's working on the proposal. Harry Reid, my conclusion, my opinion, my thought, they knew the $22 million, Harry Reid's going to get them some money. He's telling Bigelow's hiring all these people, getting the facilities set up, doing everything he could. So when the contract comes out, he's the only one positioned to win it. Mm-hmm. He's got Kurth. What's Kurth doing for a year? I don't know. But Kurth did tell me, I asked him at one point about the Nimitz case. Did they already, and this is another striking thing. The entire time he worked there, they never told him, no one ever told him that they had already known about the Nimitz case since 2005 when Harry Reid told Bob Bigelow and Bigelow told some others. So they hire Kurth. Kurth says, well, I know when Colin Keller didn't know about it when I was being interviewed. That suggests to me it had to come up in the interview though, right? Otherwise, right, for him to know that Colin had known about it, which my feeling was when Kurth applied to work at Bigelow Aerospace, if you know Bigelow's a big UFO guy. I mean, he's got the alien head all over. I mean, UFOs are his thing. If I'm sending in a letter, a resume with a cover letter, I'm going to mention that I know about this amazing UFO encounter just because it'll get my name remembered. My thinking is Kurth made mention somewhere in these several times that he applied as a mission control specialist that he knew about the Nimitz and he was involved in it. But then I think that's actually
verified by the Lukatsky book.
But Kurth tells me that nobody ever told him they'd already known about the case. And in fact, he tells me when they got the contract later at the end of 2008, he said something to the effect, it wouldn't have been a year later that I had to still tell him the Nimitz case is the best case we can investigate. And if you go back and look at all the story of Bass, the Nimitz case was really the cause célèbre. That's the main case that's been pushed all this time with Fravor and everybody else.
Right.
Not much of anything else came down.
And Bigelow did that big 60 Minutes interview about UFOs, and it like changed a lot of people's minds, and they were like really interested in it. And not long after, I mean, I think that was like almost less than a year maybe before the disclosure that he had this contract and he was storing UFO debris in his Vegas buildings, apparently was part of that New York Times story. But he was doing that interview before we knew any of that, just kind of pretending like he didn't have any kind of secret information about UFOs, just like he's just a regular person.
Those interviews that were done before we knew what we know now are going to come back to haunt some of these people. And I'll give you kind of an example of something that I have interest in doing some documentary films, and I've got 2 or 3 that I'm kind of working on, and I'm thinking I'm about to just switch over to this third one, which is around this Nimitz information, this the Bass and To the Stars situation, because I don't have to do a lot of traveling and rendering computer graphics and stuff for this last one. But here's a point that when Lukatsky's book came out that drives home, just bothers me. I mean, we don't need to know the whole truth, Lou. I agree, but I want to know enough to feel like I can be confident that the part I don't know is going to come back and bite you later, that sort of thing. Harry Reid came out in the early interviews and said, yeah, he put $22 million towards this. He's proud of it. He thinks it was one of the best things he had done. He's glad he did. I have no problem with Harry Reid. More power to the guy. I'm sorry he's gone. But what people need to realize is OSAP, and Lou Elizondo has said this in several of his interviews, OSAP was not ATIP. People ask, what is ATIP? Eric Davis said in one of the interviews he'd done, Harry Reid made ATIP up out of he pulled it out of thin air, the term ATIP. He pulled it out of thin air to use it in that SAP.
He pulled Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program out of thin air.
Yes.
But ATIC was what preceded Project Blue Book, so that's weird. It was ATIC, Advanced something technical, and that is what fed the Project Blue Book files.
Oh, you're talking about ATIC.
Yes, ATIC.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I guess I call it ATIC.
I'm talking ATIP, right? Okay, yeah, you're a little further back. That was going to be a new one to me.
That's like it's like ATIC to ATIP.
The point is,
so weird.
In the middle of, and this is where things get. I think this is the thing. Although I don't want to show all my cards yet, but the point is, in 2009, June of 2009, I believe, Harry Reid wrote what a lot of people call his SAP letter, the bigot list letter, where he wrote a letter, at least it's been put out there. I think George Knapp even released. He wrote a letter to the Office of the Secretary of Defense wanting to set up a program, a special access program with a bigot list, which means much more than just special access. You've only got a few people who are even allowed to be aware of it. The 2 names that ultimately were shown were Hal Puthoff and Lou Elizondo. Keep in mind, this is June of 2009. Coincidentally, just about 10 months after they got the first contract to begin with. So Harry Reid's original idea for an unclassified program called OSAP, that was like he said, it was really a UFO program. They all knew it was, but it was not classified, so you didn't have to go through the whole rigmarole of security clearance, whatever else. They ran it through the DIA, and there was a quote that the person at the DIA said, yeah, we'll make this look like pure science. Hal wrote the proposal. The DIA gives it to them. I think it was in August, September of pretty quick. They gave it to Bigelow, right, Bass. Then everybody goes and gets their clearances. The 10-month report, which Tim McMillan wrote about, which was the first report, generally 10 months into the first year, you provide an overview of what you've done with the money that they gave you for the first year. You give that to the DIA so they can look at it and decide, are these guys really doing what they're supposed to be doing? And you get the next allotment of money. The point I'm getting at is 10 months is right around June, right at about the same time, meaning they hadn't even completed the first year yet. They had just gotten this program going. They got 20 or 10 million, whatever the first allotment that they got. They're just rolling. Their boots on the ground now. Apparently, they'd also just begun to ask for the Nimitz information because Eric, I think in an interview he did with Linda Howe, talked about the executive summary that I think George Knapp even released a copy of that. The story that, if I recall hearing, was their program manager, maybe it was Lukatsky, the Navy did not want to give them all of the Nimitz investigative material. They would only release this declassified version, which I believe was essentially the executive summary that we've all seen, that you can see. It's basically gives an overview. You got to kind of figure out whose names were where in there based on the storyline. But they just get this thing going. And this is actually about the time Lou Elizondo comes into the picture, because of course his name appears on that letter Harry Reid wrote in June. He was already a known factor. And according to Lukatsky's book, it sounds like Lou may have been attending some meetings by that time. But who was Lou Elizondo? Am I to assume that Bob Bigelow knew Lou Elizondo sitting over there at the Pentagon? Lou Elizondo has stated in one of his interviews that two guys approached him. Remember, they asked him, what do you think about UFOs? And he said, I don't think about them. Wait, who are those two guys that seemed to know all about this was going on behind the scenes? And why would they, or now Lou, I don't know what his position was, but he was a counterintelligence security guy. Apparently they went to him and they turned him loose on whatever was going on with OSAP and HAL and all of these. The point I'm getting at is, but they'd just gotten the contract. They'd just really gotten the ball rolling. They're just doing their first 10-month report, hoping to get the next year's 5 million, or maybe the one after that. And all of a sudden, Harry Reid is writing a letter to the Office of the Secretary of Defense, trying to start up something. He makes up this name ATIP. And I think I know the last article I wrote, which unfortunately I got so frustrated, I just pulled them. I mean, I've still got them, but how can people not catch it? The point was, if you just got the first 10 million and you're not even through with the first year and you're writing your 10-month report, what would have compelled Harry Reid, with this legacy he's so proud of, that he got 22 million, not for the Pentagon, according to Lukatsky? No, the 22 million was for OSAP. They didn't give any money to ATIP. But before that first year is over with, Harry Reid's writing to OSD, trying to set up a special access program with a bigot list, totally off the books, with HAL involved, with Lou Elizondo involved. And when the whole news broke out in 2017, Harry Reid knew he didn't pay any money for ATIP. Every one of them knew the 22 million was not for the Pentagon. The 22 million was the DIA contract that went to Bass before anybody knew Lou Elizondo, before OSD had ever come into the picture. Before, in my thought process, before the Bass guys had ever turned around and requested the Nimitz information from the Navy. At that point, the cat's out of the bag.
I think in 2008, Lou Elizondo's title was Foreign Disclosure Officer from some digging I did way back when, which haven't really been able to confirm
You're right.
since.
I mean,
but I have a screenshot. I can't find it anymore.
Yeah. Now, in 2017, he was the Director of National Program Special Management Staff, which I'd looked into, and then John Ringwald looked into, and you can find that, to me, must be a really high-level sensitive position.
You're deciding what intelligence, I believe, goes out like internationally, like what the truth is. I think
Maybe.
for foreign.
My take is something as sensitive as this.
Officer. I think you can look up what that means. People could go look it up. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I have little doubt Lou was a qualified guy. He seems very measured in his wording.
Supervisor.
Very
well. The way he explained it to us, it was like he was the kid from the Kicks commercial, you know. It was like, give it to Mikey, he'll eat anything, kind of thing. And so Lou was kind of Mikey, and they gave it to him, and he was like, okay, I'll do whatever you guys want me to do. But
two guys go to him, and he goes to Bass.
Yeah.
And
well, no, that is. I think that's a good question. Who were those two guys?
Yeah. Suddenly, though, Hal and everybody else is going under the table, because even according to Eric in another interview he did recently, I don't remember who it was with, where he talked about after that point, Hal's reporting to Lou. And I'm thinking, wait. Hal and EarthTech is supposed to be a subcontractor to Bass. If I was the contractor and my subcontractor is secretly giving information to somebody else, I think I'd be livid.
Yeah.
Or I would. Why didn't Hal tell Lou? The point was this: what would have caused the turn?
Yeah.
My point is, when Harry Reid in 2017, and even up until the Lukatsky book, the world is saying Harry Reid's $22 million Pentagon money. The $22 million was the Pentagon. Never did. The $22 million was for OSAP. Why, in all the last 3 years, for example, had nobody, until Lukatsky made the point, why did nobody step up? And why didn't even Harry Reid step up in 2017 or 2018 and say, let me just make sure I'm giving you the truth of this much. I did not give $22 million to a Pentagon UFO program. The only thing that was accomplished and the point was, Harry Reid went along with it. He never acknowledged that. I think even George Knapp, on one of his interviews with Lou or somewhere, made the comment that he went to Lou a few months into 2018 when some of the OSAP information began to come out. I'm not sure exactly the dates, but asked Lou, well, wait, why didn't you tell me that the 22 million was for OSAP, this other program, not for you? And Lou's comment was something like, well, I don't talk about other people's programs.
Well, real quick,
you've led the entire world to believe that you at the Pentagon got the 22 million, and even Harry Reid and Bob Bigelow and Hal Puthoff, all the people who knew, because to me comes back to the idea of what would have been so compelling in the middle of 2009 that before the first year was up, Harry Reid would, if you know Game of Thrones, right? Harry Reid would bend the knee to OSD and want to hand over the reins to where now Hal's reporting to Lou. And we have no more 10 months reports. I mean, apparently Bass seemed to have it lasted for 2 more years. Well, wouldn't we expect another 10-month report for the second year, the third year? And if you recall, there was a point at which someone asked Lou at a conference, well, if the money ran out, how'd you continue working? Something to this effect. And Lou said, I continue to work with help from the Navy and the CIA.
Christian, we have to have you back. We have to have you back, Christian.
Anyway, this is way off my topic. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's fine. Let me get, because Rather has a hard out at 6:20. So Rather, we'll see you on
I'm
Wednesday,
sorry
my
to
friend.
have talked.
No, it's fine.
No, this is fascinating discussion. Thanks,
for you.
Christian.
We've got 2 more questions for you before you get out of here. So Rather, thank you. I'll see you on Wednesday, buddy.
Nice meeting you, Rather.
Christian.
See you again, I hope. Bye.
So we had 2 questions real quick before we bye from the audience. The first one was from is about this SCU thing. This SCU. What happened at the SCU? If you could give us sort of the abridged version.
I have been a friend of Ray Stanford's for almost 40 years. Actually, it involved the Socorro case. That's how I first met him. Ray is a peculiar character. But the second film that I discuss in my book, what's called the beam ahead, this unusual object that's flying on edge with a beam front out, that's a film that Ray took that I first saw practically before the internet was really much of anything. I went to visit him in Austin, and he had a slide screen and said, let me show you something I just got a picture of a few months ago. And he was out on the whole pier. I discuss it in the book with his kids, and this object came over and he filmed the whole thing. Ray is an unusual character, but you would know if you saw this image, holy cow. It honestly changed everything in my thinking. I'm not saying Ray and I have exchanged pictures over the years, and sure, he'd show me things and I'd say, Ray, I see what you're talking about, but it doesn't have any wow factor, meaning what can I do with it? I don't know, it's not much, what can I make of it? And we have had our differences. The symbol that was on the side of the Socorro object is a big one, that sort of thing. But still, I don't care. I have a quote. If you've ever seen the movie, what was it? The Day the Earth Stood Still. It was on the TV the other night. And so many of those characters you could see them in ufology these days. But the scientist, Sam Jaffe, looks at Michael Rennie and he says, it isn't faith that makes good science, it's curiosity. And I'm like, great. I don't care what anybody believes, but I'm willing to look. Ray had never released any of those images publicly. You'd have to go to his house to see that. That's a whole different thing. I mean, I've tried to, in my own mind, analyze why this is the case. 2012, Hal Puthoff went to visit Ray. My understanding, Kit Green had been to visit Ray at some point too. Hal Puthoff paid Ray $1,000. I was told about it at the time for showing him the stuff Ray's got. This film is the only one that I wrote about because I found out just happenstance long before Google Groups. Back in the day, it was mailing lists. I mean, this is like in the 80s, 90s when the internet was just a thing. And I'd go check the Skunk Works Digest. You know, aeronautical people would post stuff. And one night there was an image of an experiment that had been done up in New York. And here in this wind tunnel, hypershock tunnel, is this thing that I thought, holy cow, it looks just like what Ray kind of had on film, but somebody built a mock-up. Long story short, it was a professor at Rensselaer Polytechnic who suddenly turned to find out, had been to visit Ray and had seen this film and went back and mocked it up. And I have had email exchanges with this professor. It was a 10 or 20 year journey. Touchy sensitive, caught him on the phone a couple of times, one time talking about this. So I know that he knows that I know, that sort of thing. But to be long story short, Kevin Knuth, one of the members of SCU, a member of the UAP expedition, great guy, had gotten to know Ray and was going to do a presentation at the SCU conference. And he was going to show a couple of the actual images from Ray's film. Ray told me about it, and I was like, hallelujah. People outside of Ray's house will get at least some still shots from this film. The film is locked up in a safe. Even Mirabeau, the Rensselaer technician guy, knew Ray keeps it locked in a safe. But here were some images of the actual one that I tried to reproduce them in my book. Honestly, like I said, Ray and I have had differences. Part of the reason that I didn't use his real images was so he couldn't stop me. He couldn't refuse to let me show them. He's very protective. That's his right. But so I just mocked up the best I could. If you looked at the real images and Knuth was going to show, you would see I wasn't that far off. And here, all right. So here I was going to be. I got a copy of the slides. Stupidly, I say now, innocently, I went on UFO updates. And I just put a blurb. By the way, if any of you are maybe going to attend the SCU conference, it was a virtual conference, right? It was all online. Ray called me up and said, hey, would you mind getting on the conference because he's not so tech savvy? Great. If you're going to, I wrote a blurb and said, if you're going to attend this conference, you'll at least have a chance to see some actual images from this film that I discussed in my book. First time I can think of. Kevin Knuth's going to have some in there in whatever his presentation was. Right? I mean, I would have hoped you would have a chance. All I wanted was people to see. You make up your own mind.
Right.
Just see. And I don't care what you thought of Ray or Hal or anybody else, but here's the image. I get up the morning almost of the conference, and Kevin Knuth's talk has been canceled. And I got a note from Kevin when I inquired about it, and he's like, there was a gentleman who now is on Twitter. You can find him a number of places. There's another long story on that, named Douglas Johnson. D. Dean Johnson. Hadn't heard from him, but he had worked with Ray at Project Starlight back in the 1970s. So we're talking 35 years ago. Apparently, he's decided to come out of the blue, and I found that he had written me in 2019 trying to get me to stop supporting Ray, my wording, but using anonymous Proton mail addresses accounts that I caught him on now, and he's owned up to it, that, yep, this was me, Douglas Fodor, trying to say, if you say things about Ray, we're going to put out things about him. He called, my understanding, it was either Robert Powell or Rich Hoffman or both of them, and put the fear in them about showing Ray's images. And they came up and said, well, we kind of decided maybe we hadn't vetted Kevin Knuth's program, so we decided we better hold off on it.
So that's what caused the kerfuffle.
Nobody gets to see it. And I mean, I was livid. And Kevin did tell me that, yeah, it was Johnson who did it. Subsequently, Johnson went on alienexpanse.com. He's now on Twitter. He has posted so many droves of things, not about the film, but demeaning Ray because of some beliefs that Ray had back when they had the association with the understanding of man, stuff that I would say, yeah, is it channeling? Is it remote viewing? I don't know. I wasn't there. I don't care. My analogy was it's like Hal Puthoff, who everybody respects, but he's associated with Scientology, but that doesn't discredit him as a scientist.
Why didn't Kevin go outside of the SCU to share this then?
Well, it wasn't until, keep in mind, my knowledge, and I will defer to Kevin, I'm sure he can tell you what he thought. They pulled that presentation. They cut it off. It never appeared on SCU, and I think it was going to have a few more pictures in it, some better, even some enhancements Ray had done. It wasn't, I think, until the AIAA? There was another conference a couple of months later.
Yeah, that's the one. That's the one Ted Rowe went to.
Well, and that was not an SCU conference, though. That was Kevin. Sorry, getting a chance to. Hang on, let me turn this darn phone off here. He knows better. Anyway, that was Kevin having a chance to show something. And I'm glad he did. I mean, I hate to, if you want to put it mildly, he had some stones to do that. And I'm glad he did. There was one image in there that was from Ray's film, but not all the ones that would have been in the SU conference. But the SU, there was a back and forth on UFO updates after that, in which I left that group after, because I said, look, I don't care what anybody thinks about Ray personally or what he was doing back in the 70s or whether he believed this or believed that. This was a film that you at least deserve the chance to look at for yourself and make up, these images you should be seen.
Wow.
I don't know. I mean, it caused me a whole. Ray and I have kind of parted ways over some other things, but
next time we have Rich Hoffman on, I'll ask him about it. I'm curious to know what their perspective is on it.
I'm sure he'll have a good explanation.
Okay, so then I got one more question for you, and you kind of touched on this earlier, but it was a $10 super chat from Artisan Tony, and it's about how Paul passed away. Do you think it was natural causes, or do you think it was? I mean, you've already said you don't think it was self-inflicted. But can you elaborate on that a little bit? Because some people were
the only person that I knew of who had maybe known a little bit more about it might have been Greg Bishop, because he also had written about Paul Bennewitz. But I've never seen or heard from any source practically, but certainly not one that I considered somebody with firsthand information, to indicate that Paul committed suicide. There was a comment, and I believe it was Richard Doty, who made the comment, which makes me think Paul was in hospice somewhere, that he claimed he had gone, if I can believe Doty, to talk to Paul before he passed away, saying basically, I was only doing my job. Right. Whatever. And that Paul was, kind of, which suggests to me that Paul hadn't committed suicide at that point. And if wherever he was someplace in a hospice or something that Richard Doty had, I may have actually even found, although I haven't thought about it since you brought it up till now, going back and looking at some information about Paul Bennewitz, that the family was grateful to one of the nurses who had helped look out for him while he was in hospice. Whether there was something that led him to be there or whether he had just gone downhill. So I would say right now, my thinking is, no, I don't have any reason to think that he committed suicide. So I would just have to say, no, I don't think he did. But that's just what I think based on things I've seen and heard and read and lack of other information. I think he probably, I will say this much, maybe he had his health gone downhill. The one time I met him when I went to his house, and Tom, the guy that just called me, was with me. Paul opened the door thinking we were the pizza guy. That's the only reason he opened that door. But he chain smoked like you wouldn't believe. Nervous chain smoking. So I don't know whether it's enough to make you worry that somebody smokes that much may have had some health issues later on anyway. I don't mean to say that about him. I don't know, but I would say if I had to make a bet, I have no information to suggest he committed suicide. I think he probably is healthy.
I mean, he was in hospice, so you probably
that's the impression that I've gotten, and that tends to be what I think right now.
Okay. All right. Well, listen, Mr. Lambright, thank you so much for spending an extra half hour with us. I didn't think we got to have you back because there's a lot of stuff. Yeah, no, it really did. And there's also we're going to talk about the Who's Lose documentary on Wednesday. But yeah, there's definitely some interesting things that I'd love to keep digging on with you.
I think
it's
getting
been
organized
fun
and contacting
conversation.
congressmen is something that should be done. I mean, I know
I
it's
agree.
difficult. If an individual tries to call your congressman, good luck.
Yeah.
They're so busy, but a group they pay attention to. So
right, and I think it's working. I think it's working to some levels. I think that's why we're starting to see a little bit more action.
Whatever I can do.
Absolutely, I will. Christian, thank you so much.
Jane looks
no,
it's
I know Jane. Even though she's got kids, she'll let them starve to get this kind of information, right, Jane? You totally ignore your children and family.
She's waiting for you.
I was muted. It was weird. I muted my tab this time. It's amazing the things I do. So somehow I muted myself. I don't know what you guys were just saying, but I thank you so much, Christian. I always enjoy everybody I meet and talk to, but there's so many things you said and like things I want to dig into next. And
believe me, I appreciate inquiring minds and people that do have background. I'm afraid most of our congressmen probably don't really have any of this background.
No, they have no clue.
We got to
how
educate
do we?
them.
How do you get the word to them? How do you?
Yeah.
Get them
Well, I think the key is to keep it as simple as possible. They've only got so much time. The faster you can get them the information, and it's got to be impactful in their face. And then, all right, see ya.
Or nothing else. Make sure they feel like they can come to you if they really need good information. Right. Someone they can rely on that's not just trying to make a name for themselves over it.
That's a good point as well. Well, Christian, thank you so much. Before you get out of here, would you love to tell people where they can find your book and write you an email if they have any questions?
Probably Amazon is the easiest way to go. Exodus Publishing, I actually have another version of the site that's going to be Exodus Digital, where I'm hoping to do some documentary. It's already created, but I just never turned it on.
I see the tab for it here. It's
still it's in hold mode right now.
No worries.
But I actually have got a little bit of a trailer for the Socorro case, which I know a thing or two about, and I want to really pursue a documentary on the Paul Bennewitz case, but also maybe the third one, which is on this OSAP to the stars. Why did Harry Reid suddenly change what was the turning point, that kind of thing. Right. But I haven't turned it on yet.
No worries.
But otherwise they can find it out there. So
awesome. Well, okay, Christian, thank you so much for stopping by again. I'll be in contact soon. We definitely would love to have you come back.
Jane, it's a pleasure. I hope we see each other again. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Woo! Jane, that was awesome.
That was quite a ride.
That was quite a ride. I mean, look, we try never to go over the 2-hour mark, but I couldn't help myself.
That was some good. Good stuff. So
good stuff. That was a lot of fun. And look, there's some things in there that he was saying that challenge, the way I think, the way I view people. And so I love when that happens because I love challenging my thinking process and my belief system. So for me, that's always valuable. And so anytime I can talk to somebody that has a differing opinion and it's not a jerk about it, it's not.
Yeah, that's key.
So, that's key. Like just having the conversation. Hey, here's my opinions. Here's what I think about it. And it's okay if it goes against what you think. Soak in the information, see where you agree, and then move forward. And we didn't even get to go there because we didn't get to Lou Elizondo and how he got into this A-tape. I mean, that was fascinating, and I want to keep digging in on that and talking to him more on that. And we're gonna get a chance to talk about this film that had used clips from our show. They never got our permission. Apparently, John Greenwald's really pissed about it now too. So it's pretty wild. But yeah, we'll talk about it, and we'll have fun with it like we always do. Take the topic seriously, just not ourselves too seriously. So, Jane, what are you working on this week? Anything?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure what the next video will be posted, but right now you can see I got a
When are we getting that Jason McClellan video?
I'm editing the second interview right now, so Jason McClellan is done, and I'm editing a second interview. I know. And I was promising, and then January went way off the rails. So there's an irony just going on with the universe right now. But there's going to be some. there's gonna be some perfect timing. I just know, like, it's gonna be all for a reason. But right now, there's a for people think about Roswell and saucers, and I stumbled upon a CIA file and then found some other things on DuckDuckGo. By the way, I couldn't find it on Google. About a 1952, German saucer and humanoid encounter that maybe was of interest to Project Blue Book at some point, but people can go check that out. A really cool witness drawing that, of a clear, distinct shape. Just like, we were talking about is missing from the UAP term, right? That was like the classic flying saucers, where you kind of knew what you were getting. So did a little breakdown of that. And then Weird Hollywood, we went in depth on Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So if you're, who's not a fan of that movie?
Yeah. I mean, guys, Jane's link is in the description below. So go check out her show, subscribe, obviously ring her bell, and that way you can get entertained on all fronts. But real quick before we get out of here, I want to say thank you to my sister for the $4.99 super sticker. I want to say thank you to the Sparky Lady with a $2 donation. Since this is a cool conversation, thanks, Christian. The UFO Garage stopped by. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. Always a pleasure. You're the best. I love you guys. And then user not found. I thought this was just a funny comment. Please get rid of Luis. He's the worst.
No.
Always screws up / derails the convo.
Oh gosh, you don't want to leave me to all the clicking. I exit myself out.
Yeah.
I mute myself.
Listen, we make this look easy, but it's not as easy as it looks. Jane, thank you so much for being here today. That was a fun conversation. Before we get out of here, of course, I want to say thank you to DOS Tapes. They provide all of the tunes you hear on the show. Their Bandcamp link is in the description below. This show will be available on iTunes, Spotify, podcasts as soon as the show's over. So please go leave us a rate and review on the podcast. It goes a very long way to making sure the show continues to grow. Want to say thank you to the existing Patreon members. Want to say thank you to the members who are not members yet that are going to be members soon. For as little as $1 a month, you can join the Patreon. Help support this public access channel that we're doing here, giving you shows at least 3 days a week, up to 5 sometimes, depending on what's going on. Of course, want to say thank you again to the Super Chats. Want to say thank you to the moderators and everyone who submitted questions and was just active in the chat. I love all of you guys in there. Thank you so much. Check out the links again for Jane, for Rather, for Christian Lambright, all in the description below, right underneath the video. So just click show more and you'll see all the links. And of course, check out the merch store. Thank you to KGR8DB Broadcasting, where we are there every Friday from 1 to 3 o'clock. Other than that, you guys, thank you all so damn much for coming aboard, getting weird with us here on another episode of the Unidentified Celebrity Review, your home for credible news, reviews, and commentary on everything UAP and UFO. My name's Luis Jimenez. That is Jane Kyle, aka UFO Jane. Until tomorrow, we've got who do we got tomorrow? Dave Beatty on Daniel Miller's Unknown Quantities, or Known Quantities. Known Quantities. So check it out. We'll see you guys tomorrow at 1 o'clock. Love you all. Peace. I'm going to tell you all right now, all of these wonderful people would not be here without Patreon supporters like you. If you enjoy credible news, reviews, and commentary on UFOs and UAPs 5 days a week, you want to support this show. What's your name? Marty. Marty, look how easy this is, Marty. Pick up your phone. Boom, you're a Patreon member. I mean, look, it's so easy. You just click the link, which is right here. Just for $1 a month, you can support this show. Just fill out the information and pledge what's comfortable for you. It could be $1, $5, $10, or who knows. Just support.